Azeroth Sector, Beranos System. 744.m32. War came to Beranos 3 once more, even as the embers of its apocalypse smoldered still. In the wake of the Chaos Fleet's defeat, Morkoth withdrew his remaining ships to the planet's orbit, meeting up with the Eidolon of Regret. The Dark Mechanicum Forge barge had been left behind, its value too high to risk in a direct engagement with the foe. Until the last moment, its assembly lines and infernal foundries continued to spit out weapons and ammunition, which were delivered to the Unbound host's great stronghold on the surface in a steady stream of cargo conveyors. When Morkoth judged that they could hold their position no longer, the remains of the Unbound fleet broke orbit, seeking refuge in the immense void of the Beranos system, away from many of its planetoids. Their ships were faster than the bulk of the Imperial Armada, and the Unbound Fleetmaster was rightfully confident that the Imperial Navy would not attempt to pursue them. While keeping an eye on Morkoth's force, the Imperial fleet turned its attention on Beranos 3. The planet had been made a desolate wasteland by the Chaos invasion, its once populous hive cities turned into ever-burning wrecks. Auspex scans revealed that there were still signs of life within these ruins, but the Inquisitors rejected any proposition to try and rescue these potential survivors. Beranos 3 had been tainted by the forces of chaos, and its people were considered lost to the Emperor's light. The Inquisitors knew that not all civilians had been turned to the ruinous powers. There would be plenty who had somehow managed to survive, hiding from the invaders in terror, prayers to the God Emperor on their lips. But they also knew, from bitter experience, that some would be, and they would not risk the crusade to save a few thousand souls. Exterminatus wasn't an option, not with the strength at their disposal and the risk that destroying the planet may damage the warp routes leading from Beranos to the rest of Azeroth. But inquisitorial ships parted from the Imperial Armada, and rained death upon the husks of hive cities and settlements until not a single trace of life remained there. The primary fortress of the Chaos forces was easy to identify. In their hubris, the leaders of the Unbound host had turned one of Beranos 3's mountains into a vast stronghold, and surrounded it by a circle of lesser forts where hundreds of thousands of heretics awaited the coming of judgment. After a few testing salvos, the engineers calculated that breaching the void shields covering the fortress would require focusing the near totality of the Imperial firepower, leaving them exposed to a strike from the remaining heretical space forces. Landing near the hollowed mountain was also ill-advised, as these would be the most heavily trapped grounds on the planet as well as those within range of the stronghold's anti-air guns. Other landing zones were found, both close enough to the Chaos Fortress and suitable to unload the numerous armies massed in the Imperial transports. Space Marine strike forces were sent first, ready to deal with any ambush waiting, and after them were sent the transports of the Astra Militarum. Millions of guardsmen were unloaded onto Beranos 3, yet for all their multitude they were but the tip of the spear that would be thrown onto Azeroth to liberate the sector. The hulls of the gargantuan troop carriers were emptied, as the destruction of the Chaos forces on the planet was the main goal of the first Imperial thrust into Azeroth, and the strength of the enemy defenses would require all of the strength at the disposal of the Imperial War Council. Both chapter masters of the Red Hunters and Purple Stars had come to Azeroth, and both sat on this council. Alongside them was Inquisitor Galarine, representing the Ordosh presence in the fleet, Lord General Frederick Elgain, who was in overall command of the Imperial Guard regiments, and Lady Admiral Rebecca Delbaranthia. These 5 souls were the masters of the Imperial forces in Beranos, and with the quiet departure of the Grey Knights, the fate of the system was in their hands alone. Together, they devised the deployment of their forces. There were several approaches to the Chaos Fortress, and by separating their troops so that they could follow these different paths to the same objective, the Imperial commanders were hoping to surround the heretics, trapping them in their hollow mountain with nowhere left to run. With the sound of boots and tank tracks crushing the earth, the armies of the Imperium began to march across Beranos 3's continents. The nearest host was still over 800 kilometers from the heretic stronghold, while the furthest was almost an entire continent away, with 3,000 kilometers to cross. But those were distances as seen from space. The actual paths to the goal would be much more complicated than mere straight lines. The forces assigned to each landing zone had been chosen for their ability to cross the terrain they would face on their way as much as in combination that would be able to face any opposition. This turned out to be a sensible precaution, for the first ambush happened less than 6 hours after the first pair of Departamento Munitorum approved boots hit the ground. The Unbound Lord had let loose those armies under his command ill-suited for defensive fighting, tasking them with making the Imperials suffer as they advance across Beranos III. The Knights of Biriban, cannibal riders mounted on the mutated beasts of their homeworld, caught the Astarian 149th by surprise when they climbed down several hundred meters of sheer cliff face. Despite their initial victory, the Knights were soon wiped out, as the 297th Taurian Artillery Regiment unleashed the wrath of its engines upon them during their ritualistic post-victory feast. The Cerulean companies were the greatest of their world's mercenary forces, and their banner had flown for hundreds of years when the Unbound Lord had arrived. A coalition of 100 captains, each commanding 100 men, women, and things that were not human at all, they had fought for the coin of the dread Dukes of Jevaloth, until those sorceress lords had been slaughtered by the Unbound, their palaces cast down and their treasures plundered. Now they fought with all the tricks they had learned during those years, unleashing a nightmare of guerrilla warfare upon the Astra Militarum. By the time the last of the 10,000 Cerulean mercenaries had been slain and the contract binding them to Mahone's will was fulfilled at last, they had cost the Imperium near 20 times that number of guardsmen, along with the governor's ransom of armor and materiel. As the Alinnian 732nd Armored Regiment crossed the misted plains that had once served as a dumping ground for the refineries of a nearby hive, they were beset by feral ghosts. The Sisters of Enragelos called forth the spirits their order had bound and used as weapons for generations. The wraiths passed right through the tank's armor and made sport of the crew inside, until the regiment's sanctioned psychers located the sisters through the chemical mist and their commanding officer ordered a blind and overwhelming strike on that position. East of the Chaos stronghold, in a pass snaking across a chain of mountains, the Count of Hirienkov and his retinue of soul-scarred servants held their ground against the Vostroyan 17th for an entire week, using their surroundings to counter the foe's greater numbers. When the Count was finally slain, his corpse burst apart, revealing a vast insectoid monstrosity that killed dozens of Vostroyan firstborn before flying off into the mountains, never to be seen again. It took 3 hours and 27 executions by the commissars to get the regiment moving again, so horrifying had been the sight, and even then, the Vostroyans didn't start to relax until the pass was behind them. The 3rd Company of the Red Hunters, reunited after the fleet engagement, spent its entire journey harassed by the Congregation of the Brass Hand. The cult had been given free rein into one of the eastern fallen hive cities, and its magisters had forcibly inducted tens of thousands of imperial subjects into its ranks. Men, women and children, their right hands severed at the wrist and replaced by cheap brass prosthetics branded with unholy sigils, hurled themselves at the ceramite-clad transhumans, driven to madness by fear and the whispers of their own tainted hands. It was barely enough to slow the Red Hunters, who waded through blood and corpses. But while the chapter's service to the Inquisition had hardened the minds of all but the youngest hunters to such sights and deeds, such was not the case for the human armies that followed in their wake, whose soldiers were horrified at the carnage the Emperor's angels of death have wrought. For 12 days, the assault marines of the Purple Star's 2nd and 4th Companies hunted the Anointed of Dusk amidst mounds of rusted machinery, ancient ruins that predated the current invasion of Beranos III by millennia. The running battle between the jetpack-wearing Space Marines and the shrouded mutants only ended when the champion of the Anointed was dragged beneath the antediluvian rubble by things which resembled mechadendrites but were something entirely different. Terrified by the techno-horror the battle had awakened, the Anointed of Dusk sought to flee, only to be slaughtered by the rest of the 2 companies' warriors, who had been walking around the edges of that dread battlefield. Upon receiving word of what had occurred within, the chapter master ordered the region abandoned for now. Whatever lay beneath these ruins of the dark age of technology would be a concern for another day. All the while, Imperial Navy fighters, those not rated for space flight and that had thus been spared from the unkindness clause, dueled with the escorts of Dark Mechanicum bombers, keeping the forces on the ground safe. Skies choked with pollution were the theater of 100 engagements and more, the aces of the Navis Imperialis matching their skills against the infernal perceptions of Argentine constructs. One by one, the armies that survived the journey arrived to where the unbound host had chosen to make its stand against the wrath of the Imperium it had defied. Trenches were dug and bastions raised all around the hollow mountain, while the Imperial Armada established a blockade above, cutting off all avenues of escape. And then, finally, weeks after Imperial planetfall, the battle for Beranos III began in earnest. 6 months later, Marcus the Riven stood on an observatory carved high up in the flank of the hollow mountain. They had heard the name in an intercepted Imperial transmission, and it had spread through the ranks. Apparently the Lord Malone had found it amusing. From there, he watched the battle unfold on the northern side of the Unbound Host's last fortress on Beranos 3. An array of auspexes was spread across the observatory, with their crews of heretics and servitors, scanning the plain below and sending the collated data both to the Hollow Mountains Stratagem deep within and to Marcus' own custom, bulky data pad. There, a machine spirit that had once been the brain of the conqueror of a world of the Wailing Storm analyzed the information and provided a simplified overview to the Riven. 3 months had passed since the last of the outlying bastions had fallen, its defenders retreating across the plains between the Hollow Mountain and the ring of ruined lesser strongholds. Already millions had died in the siege, Imperials and members of the Unbound Host both. Their bodies littered the network of trenches spreading from the Hollow Mountain's artillery range to the bottom of the peak. And yet still more fought. Garbled transmissions from the remaining fleet had told of a steady flow of Imperial reinforcements, all of whom were sent there, to this siege. Here and there, amidst the blood and mud, demigods clashed. Unbound warriors in black armor fought the Purple Stars and the Red Hunters, while around them mortals died in droves. Astartes on both sides of the conflict had been slain by lesser troops since the beginning of the Battle of Beranos, although Marcus suspected some of the most martially inclined factions of the host would disagree with that classification, but in the end, it was better to leave the demigods fight among themselves rather than rely on the 100-to-1 chance that someone would manage to bring them down. Unfortunately, the host had precious few demigods left to bring to the field. A great many Unbound had died in the Void Battle, and few of the survivors had managed to reach the stronghold ahead of the Imperial fleet. Morkoth and the remnants of the Forsaken Sons fleet hung in the void still, preventing the Imperial armada from bringing to bear the amount of firepower needed to breach the void shields covering the stronghold. But by the same token, if Morkoth were to bring his Unbound to reinforce the defenders, his ships would be broken by the corpse god slaves. They still had the edge in sorcery. The Imperials had learned the hard way not to make advances after dusk. There were voices in the trenches at night, lurking in the shadows cast by flickering torches and whispering awful things to soldiers on both sides. The barrier between reality and the immaterium had been thinned by bloodshed and sorcery, and the Neverborn were pushing, trying to get in. Ancient demons of plague and terror, born in the long-forgotten conflict that had seen mankind first learn the horrors of trench warfare, buzzed over the battlefield, plunging into the unprotected corpses of the slain and making puppets of rotten meat with which to walk the broken land. To the Riven, it felt almost like home. There were priests in the trenches that bore the sigil of the Inquisition, and librarians as well as sanctioned psykers attached to the Imperial Guard. They castigated the Neverborn with words of faith and hatred, or burned their incarnate forms with psychic fire and lightning. None of the Imperial warp sensitives were ever allowed to walk alone. More than a few had succumbed to demonic possession, and now they all lived under the threat of a swift execution. The host had priests of their own, their eyes opened to the primordial truth by the myriad horrors of the Wailing Storm, their faith sharpened by the dark apostles of the Forsaken Sons into a blade they wielded at the behest of their transhuman masters. The House of Darkness, the Circle of Hunger and the Path of Unbalance had held dominion over entire nations before the Unbound had found them. They walked in the trenches still, shouting hymns of ruin and glory, bestowing dark miracles upon those willing to pay their terrible price. In the early days of the siege, there had been many such martyrs, who had blazed bright through the trenches as infernal energies coursed through their flesh. Such demon hosts had ripped through the lines of guardsmen, slaughtering dozens before being put down. But by sheer attrition, the flow of those willing to offer up their soul to the Neverborn had all but dried, and now the ruinous priests had only the occasional zealot willing to burn to help turn around a desperate battle. Then again, all battles were desperate now. And so they bled, and died, to make the enemy bleed in kind. Marcus wasn't blind. He knew the host could not hold Beranos, not for long. Nor had it ever been meant to. The mongrel horde had been thrown in the path of the Imperium's retribution. And like the Shiva's wrath, whose broken remains now drifted in orbit after the Imperials had pummeled it to scrap, it had not been meant for more than one strike. They were all going to die here, one defiant last stand against the Imperium's gargantuan war machine, throwing their lives away in the hope of forcing its gears to stall. This did not worry Marcus. The fear of death had been torn from him long before the Unbound host had found him. He had lived far longer than he had any right to, born as he had been on that island of black, jagged rocks surrounded by a roiling sea haunted by leviathans. But at the same time, he did not think that the Unbound Lord was as content with their inevitable doom as he. Malone had to be planning something, and Marcus was curious to find out what it was. Most of it was madness, but some of it was courage. In Marcus' opinion, the Imperials had made a mistake. They had completely surrounded the Unbound host, cutting off all possible paths of escape. With nowhere to run, the only thing left to do was to fight and die well, making the foe pay such a price the gods would take notice. Had he been in command of the Imperial war effort, he would have dedicated enough resources to hold the Unbound host down and send the rest of his forces to the help of the Azeroth sector. But the pride of the Imperium would not let them continue their liberation campaign until the Forsaken Sons had been purged from this system first. Marcus' role had once been to keep the numerous mortal factions of the Unbound host under control, to prevent them from turning against one another and to speak for them at the war councils of the Lord of the Unbound. With the siege underway, that role had more or less ended, and the Riven had instead been assigned to the Observatory, to put his mind to work helping anticipate the actions of the Imperial side and direct the reserves to where they were most needed. There was another observatory on the Hollow Mountain's southern side, where the Lord Carcius had settled, but the northern front was Marcus to direct, and direct it he did. This was his gift, the reason why he had survived longer than any of his people. He could read the currents, see what was about to happen before it did. It had helped him overcome his initial difficulties in understanding other people, and had allowed him to keep a horde of millions of fanatics and madmen from tearing itself apart. But its first purpose had always been to see the threat before it could kill him. He had heard some of the older Astartes say that this was similar to the Lord Malone's own brand of genius, though he suspected there were differences lost on the casual observer. Marcus had watched Malone during the conquest of the Wailing Storm. The Chosen of Archon had flashes of inspiration that let him see paths not considered by others, either in single combat or on a strategic level, but it fell to others, usually the Lord Igdal, to make that vision a reality. Marcus' own talent was more mundane, more grounded. He saw threats before they manifested, and he could see how to act to stop them. The artillery of the Hollow Mountain was potent, but the ammunition stores were running low, and every shell had to be carefully spent for maximum effect. With a word, he could command the cannons, unleashing devastation upon any mass of Imperial forces that were detected by the scouts and auspexes. In the last months, he had seen many things, as the strategists of the Imperial Guard used every trick they could think of to try and breach the gate at the base of the mountain's northern side. And what he saw right now made no sense. The Imperials were gathering strength, bringing in tens of thousands of fresh guardsmen up the trenches and at the base of the Hollow Mountain. But as things stood, launching an assault would only see them slaughtered by the Unbound host's coordinated response, unless, driven by some nameless instinct, Marcus looked up, and something like a smile twisted his lips. There, through the pollution and ash clouds that cut off the peak of the Hollow Mountain, human-sized figures were falling. Drop troopers, unleashed from low orbit with only the grav chutes attached to their back to give them any chance of surviving the fall. They were just small enough to be all but impossible for the anti-air defenses of the Hollow Mountain to target them accurately. Marcus laughed, delighted, and clapped his scarred hands together. One really had to admire such suicidal bravery. Inaccurate or not, the fire of the anti-air batteries was cutting through the drop troopers, slaughtering dozens of them even as the rest continued their descent. One of the new troop transports arriving in the system must have brought them, giving the Imperial commanders a new tool in their arsenal. If they could destroy the observatory, they would effectively rip out one of the Unbound host's eyes, and there was no telling what damage the troopers would do before being caught and killed. There were hundreds of kilometers of tunnels across the Hollow Mountain, and most of its defenders were either dead or holding its gates. A few squads could remain hidden for weeks, launching hit-and-run attacks on important targets and diverting strength from the front lines in order to keep them secure. "Prepare yourself, my friends," Marcus called out to the heretics. "We are about to have company." Shrieks of corrupt machine cant filled the air as the heretics realized their peril. They pulled out of consoles made of meat as much as metal and gathered their minions to their side. None of them were defenseless. The inner politics of the Dark Mechanicum were, Marcus had been told, even more vicious than those of their loyalist counterpart. Whether the precautions that had kept this bunch safe from assassination would hold up to real soldiers was yet to be seen. Marcus himself carried no weapon. He had never had the need for them. The first drop trooper hit the ground, his grav chute slowing him down at the very last second. To his credit, it only took him a few seconds to get his bearings, but before he could even draw his last gun, half a dozen heretics had already opened fire, reducing him to nothing more than a greasy stain on the observatory's stone floor. The second and third guardsmen met similar fate, but eventually one of them managed to hit the ground rolling, dodging the heretic's fire until he reached one of them and stabbed it in the chest with a combat knife. As the heretic's attention focused on that single soldier, his comrades still in the air triggered their grav chutes early, and began to rain down last fire upon the heretics from above, catching them by surprise. Within moments, the observatory had been cleaned, and nearly 40 drop troopers stood scattered on the platform. None of them, Marcus noted, had missed the observatory or failed to trigger their grave chute in time. "Well done," he called out to the drop troopers in Low Gothic, and his accent sent shivers down their spines even as they turned toward him. "Now let's see if you can kill me, slaves of the corpse god." A half-circle of elite Imperial stormtroopers aimed their weapons at Marcus, somehow sensing he was the real threat on the balcony, preparing to fire all at once. The clicking of their vox was the only audible sign that they were communicating with each other beneath their sealed helmets. The Riven smiled, and the sight of his teeth made them open fire. Iams of the Unbound saw the universe collapse around him. It was always different. This time, there was thunder and screams, and the laughter of demons. It was all he could hear as reality cracked and fell apart. Matter split and time frayed, letting through the things that dwelled in the Empyrean and beyond, abominable shapes that could never be comprehended by those born of the Materium. His own body dissolved as the laws that held it together became obsolete, and he felt something impossibly vast brush against what remained of his essence. The vision ended, and he was back on the battlefield, standing at the Hollow Mountain's northern gate, with sorcerous fire in his hand and the extremity of his tentacle wrapped around his dagger's handle. Before him, hundreds of guardsmen were emerging from the trenches, rushing through the no-man's land, separating the trenches from the gate in half-squads, too small and spread out for the heavy artillery to target. Next to him, heavy guns fired into the Imperials, tearing flesh asunder and sending the broken bodies join those already laid down upon the broken earth. Around him were those who had been chosen to defend the gate. The monks of the Nameless Day had begun as a sect of the Imperial Creed, whose members lived in seclusion atop snow-covered mountains, separated from the rest of the world and spending their existence meditating on the words of the God Emperor. But when the wailing storm had been unleashed, they had been closest to the skies, and the entire monastery had been warped into something very different by the baleful energies emanating from the sundered heavens. When the Unbound host had come to their world, the monks of the Nameless Day had emerged from the walls of their monastery clad in suits of Baroque armor and carrying heavy melee weapons of infernal design, and had knelt before the Unbound without a word. As far as Iams knew, none of them had ever spoken since, nor had any of them taken off their armor, even to eat or drink. The 50 monks stood alongside Iams at the gate, defending the weapon emplacements behind them. They were locked in battle with the few guardsmen who had made it to the foot of the Hollow Mountain, cutting them down with ruthless efficiency, every stroke of their blades a prayer to the ruinous powers, that they may bring forth the day for which they lived. Iam's hold on to the flow of battle had not been interrupted by his vision of universal oblivion. He knew that the Imperials were pushing again, sending thousands more to assault the gate despite the horrendous casualties they were taking in the process. They were pouring from the trenches, having defeated the infiltrator squads of the Unbound host scattered across them. In his chest, Iam's heart beat. 1. With an effort of will, he intensified the aura of dread that permanently cloaked him like a mantle. One of the reasons why the monks had been assigned to this duty along with him was that they weren't affected by it, a side effect of whatever transformation the wailing storm had wrought upon them. The guardsmen recoiled with horrified cries, their feeble wills overwhelmed. Some collapsed outright, bloody tears running from their eyes as they convulsed, their brains fried by sheer terror. The few who continued their charge were cut down by the monks, their feeble weaponry failing to penetrate their thick-plated armor. Every cut was aimed according to unholy geometries that had been burned into the minds of the men who had become the monks, every blow an offering to the Nameless Day they had given themselves unto. 2. Iams tasted blood in his own mouth as well. Though Jerub's grand ritual had been thwarted and the psychic power it had accumulated to sunder the veil been used to cauterize the tear instead, cauterized flesh was still sensible. All across Beranos 3, any use of psychic power resonated with increased strength, sending pain-filled echoes across the immaterium. Ritualized sorcery was ironically safer, which was why the dark priests could perform their ceremonies without being devoured by the very entities they were calling upon, but drawing directly upon one's unnatural talents now came with an increased cost. Iams swallowed a mouthful of his own blood, just as a glimpse of red drew his attention back to the trenches. 3. There they were, the Space Marines. Without transhuman support, there was no way for mere mortals to take this gate, not as long as Iams and the monks of the Nameless Day held it. By the color of their warplate, those were Red Hunters. The purple stars had been deployed in the southern front, and while the maze of trenches had made sure Iams had fought them, all but 2 of the 19 Space Marines he had killed since the beginning of the siege had belonged to that chapter. 7 Red Hunters charged, firing their bolters with pinpoint accuracy. With a wave of his tentacle, Iams raised a kinetic shield before him and the monks. The shells slammed into it uselessly, but such a barrier wouldn't hold up to the warriors themselves. Within seconds, the Space Marines clashed with the monks of the Nameless Day. 4. Lightning sparked from Iam's mutated limb, catching 2 Red Hunters and burning them to ash within their armor. They had marked him as the greatest threat, and 2 of them parted to keep the monks at bay while the remaining trio converged on the sorcerer. There was something in the way they moved that told Iams that this wasn't the first time these warriors faced a wielder of the warp's powers. All members of the Red Hunters chapter seemed to possess that kind of experience, not that it had saved them from him. 5. He took a step back just in time to avoid a blow that would have severed his head. The air around him darkened as he drew upon the power of the warp to intensify his dread aspect once more. He didn't expect the Space Marines to panic, but even they reacted to the sudden pressure on their psyche. That brief slip was enough for him to imbue his tentacle with eldritch energy and strike at the helmet of one of the 3, the warp-touched flesh pulping metal, bone and brain. 6. His boots slammed on the ground, and spectral hands rose from the blood-soaked earth, clasping at the 2 Red Hunters and hampering their mobility long enough for him to blast the one to his left with a bolt of psychic energy that tore a smoking hole in his chest. 7. With a might war cry, the remaining Space Marine descended upon him, his chainsword held in both hands as it plunged toward him. Iams slapped the weapon aside with his tentacle, teeth clenched as the pain of the adamantium teeth biting through the skin and spilling blood registered even through his deadened senses. 8. He raised his left hand, aiming the dagger at the loyalist's gorget. 9. Once again, the cracks in reality began to spread, time slowing to a crawl as everything fell apart around Iams. Light faded as darkness engulfed all things, drowning him in a tide of frozen, endless night. The sorcerer hardened his mind, and prepared to witness the universe's end once more, while in his mind's eye he considered the battlefield his body still stood on and considered his next move. This, after all, was the nature of those who followed chaos, how to take advantage of the curses you collected on the path to glory. In the wailing storm, the hag had cursed him with her last breath. "You have destroyed my world," she had croaked out amidst the flames that burned down her mansion of rotten wood held together by the skins of her victims, "and so you will watch your world end until the day you die." And in his exhaustion from their duel, he had not felt the power behind those words until they had tightened around his soul and the cycle of hallucinations had begun. Every time, he would get the time it took for his 2 hearts to beat 9 times, before the vision would return. The Flesh Masters had given him drugs he could take outside of battle to slow his cardiac rhythm, but it hadn't been enough. Soon he had spent most of his time in suspended animation, every beat of his heart separated by entire hours. It had been Malone's decision, and one Iams did not fault his commander for. A sorcerer going insane was a terrifying prospect, especially in a warp storm. When the forces of the Forsaken Sons had gathered once more, Iams had gone to see Asim, the Lord of the Coven. The blood sorcerer had told him that it was too late to remove the curse. It had become too deeply woven into his soul, to the point that attempting to purge it would cripple him at best, and destroy him at worst. Instead, Asim had taught him ancient methods to focus his mind, to hold on to his power through the shattering of his perception that the curse brought with metronomic regularity. Under the tutelage of the Sorcerer Lord, the Unbound had learned to use the curse to his advantage, ignoring the horrifying feeling of reality collapsing and using the time out of time to sharpen his thoughts and tighten his will. But there had still been the fear of madness, for what mind could truly bear to see everything goes to ruin, again and again? And so a bargain had been struck, with Arsum as the intermediary. It had not been the first deal Iams had made. During the conquest of the Wailing Storm, cut off from the Coven, he had been forced to learn however he could. But it had been the most significant. In exchange for all the memories of his life before becoming an Unbound, Iams had been granted protection from his vision's horror. He could watch reality break, over and over, and never feel anything more than irritation at his activities in reality being interrupted. And so, when the vision ended, the darkness parted and he was back on Beranos 3, his stride was unperturbed, and his blow still struck true. The dagger burrowed itself into the throat of the Space Marine, its deceptively frail edge cutting through the power cables and the transhuman flesh with ease. Rich arterial blood spurted, some of it spilled onto Iam's face, but he did not feel its heat, another of the many prices he had paid for his powers. The Space Marine fell, last of the 7 who had made it through the trenches, but these 7 weren't the last. Already Iams could see a new figure emerge from the death-infested tunnels, followed by others. 1. Not a mid-battle brother, this one. He took in the words in High Gothic inscribed upon the scarlet armor, the ornate helmet and the priceless armaments. The warriors who came behind this one wore similar gear, though none as blazing in his sight with glorious history and deeds. Chapter Master. The Forsaken Sons knew of these, the leaders of the gutted legions. Each commanding 1,000 Space Marines in the name of the false Emperor and the lost Primarchs. Warlords of the weak and mewling Imperium that had risen from the ashes of Horus Rebellion and Gulaman's breaking. Yet there was no denying that this one would be strong, stronger than any other Astartes had ever fought, yet he had faced worse things, in the Wailing Storm, and emerged triumphant. He would triumph here, too. 2. The Chapter Master and his Praetorian Guard charged the lines of the monks, holding great shields before them to absorb the gunfire leveled at them. Iams reached out with his 6th sense and unleashed a stream of warp fire upon the Red Hunters, but the symbols laid upon their shields in golden filigree blazed bright, and he felt the threads of sorcerous power slip away from his grasp. 3. He raised an eyebrow. This was new. He had known the Red Hunters specialized in taking down the targets of the Inquisition, but to think that the Imperium actually had access to such wardings. In the name of the Emperor, die, heretic! Roared the Chapter Master. Holding his sword in both hands, he rushed toward Iams. 4. Faced with an enemy that was both stronger and had a longer range than him, Iams drew deep from the Empyrean's energies, imbuing his transhuman flesh with even greater potency. Dark claws slithered on his skin, and the air above his head blurred to show a screeching, crowned visage, and he felt blood flow from his eyes, nose and mouth. But the sorcerous boost enabled him to block the Chapter Master's two-handed blow with his dagger, the ritual weapon comically small when compared to the energy-wrought power sword. For a breath's length, the two of them struggled against one another. 5. With a grunt, Iams lashed out with his tentacle. The mutated limb tore a rent in the outer layers of the Chapter Master's chest plate, but failed to draw blood. He stepped back, letting one of the monks charge at the Chapter Master. 6. The Space Marine did not even slow down. In a single strike, he beheaded the armored Chaos Warrior, his sword cutting through the infernal plate covering the monk's head with ease. Black smoke poured from the headless body's neck as it fell, but the Chapter Master did not wait. He rushed toward Iams, sword at the ready, looking every bit the vengeful angel of death come to deliver the Emperor's judgment upon those who had defiled his kingdom. Suddenly, with his psychic sight opened wide, Iams caught a glimpse of something impossibly vast and powerful behind the Chapter Master, something which looked upon him and all his work and felt nothing but contempt. Something cloaked in bone dust and corroded gold. It only lasted for a flash, but it was enough, and Iams' focus slipped. His heart sped up. 7, 8, 9. The Chapter Master exploded in a shower of scarlet pieces surrounded by a halo of deadly sunlight. Tendrils of colorless energy reached out for him. Teeth made of the death cries of worlds closed in on his soul. He shook with the vibration of a distant black hole being born. Reality slammed back into focus. Iams stumbled, his balance lost. Decades of training and experience allowed his foe to seize this minute opening, and the sword of the Chapter Master slipped under Iams' guard and through his chest. The sorcerer stood, frozen, as the Space Marine ripped his weapon free in a shower of gore. His heart's His hearts were no longer beating, because they were gone. He could no longer feel the witch's curse, could no longer hear the coming apocalypse. "Go to your false gods, heretic scum," spat the chapter master, striking again at Iam's immobile form, sending his body crashing onto the ground, blood pooling beneath it. Within moments, as the monks of the Nameless Day fell one by one to the elite of the Red Hunters, Iam's soul slipped away from the ruination of his flesh and into the roiling Empyrean. On the other side, every bargain he had ever made waited for him with tooth and claw. The fortress had been breached, as he had known it eventually would be. Jacaerus pressed runes on his workstation, the tremors of distant explosions already reaching the medical bay dug deep within the hollow mountain. The patients laying on the operating tables shuddered as massive amounts of stims, mixed with more exotic ingredients harvested in the wailing storm, were suddenly injected into their bodies. Of the 12 unbound, only 5 rose to their feet, the remaining 7 briefly convulsing before their hearts burst in their chest. An acceptable result, thought the Fleshmaster, considering the alternative had been to leave them for the Imperium to find. All of them had had wounds extensive enough that it would have taken days for them to recover naturally, days that they didn't have. And perhaps something could be learned from dissecting those who had perished. The effects of some of the ingredients he had used in his cocktail were still barely understood, after all. The noise of the door opening interrupted his thoughts. He turned, hand moving to the pistol at his hip, before letting it fall as he recognized the newcomer. "Igdil. What are you doing here?" "Karkios is dead," replied the Unbound bluntly. "Among others." Well, that certainly was cause for concern. Karkios' death was a grave loss, made more so by the fact he had been the last son of Perturabo among the Unbound host. The monstrous tank Antipater's wrath had been destroyed along with all 3 of Karkios' brother 2 months into the siege, during a brutal engagement across the plains. The former Iron Warrior had grown even more bitter and sullen after that, driving the forces under his command on the northern front into battle without any pretense of care for their lives beyond the cold arithmetic of war. But brutal as that approach had been, it had worked. Without him. "Then the northern gate has fallen?" he asked. "Yes, along with the one in the south." The chapter master of the Red Hunters showed up in person and killed Iams. No mortal could have seen the minute shifts in Malone's posture that revealed the slightest hint of grief at the sorcerer's demise. On the northern end, the Purple Stars sent 3 dreadnought against the ones who walks. They took 2 of them down, but were wiped out, and the last one punched the gates open with its power claw. "There is more to it," Jacaerus said. "Even if the gates are breached, the Imperials still have to contend with a mountain-sized labyrinth of tunnels, choke points and traps. A strike force breaking through would have almost no hope of reaching anywhere useful." "There is. How do you think Karkios died in the first place?" "The Imperials are raining men on us. They are throwing an entire regiment of drop troopers with some kind of gravity-manipulating parachutes down on us, taking out our artillery." Jacaerus blinked, the nictitine membrane that had appeared in his eyes as his reptilian mutations continued to develop briefly covering his vertical pupils. Gravitic technology in the hands of mere guardsmen? They hadn't had anything like that during the Great Crusade, at least not as far as he knew, and as a former Alpha Legionnaire, he had known a lot. It seemed that the Imperium wasn't quite as static as the exiled Space Marines had come to believe, after all. "Surely they didn't take down all of our guns? We did have defenses put in place against the possibility of teleportation strikes making it through lapses in the void shields, or assault marines managing to reach them despite our anti-air defenses." "Of course not," scoffed Igdil, "but enough of the platforms have fallen silent that the Imperial commanders are sending in their tanks and transports across the trenches. When I left the Stratagem, they were finishing putting up reinforced plankways for them to advance on. This was planned, Jacaerus, since weeks ago. Strike at us from above to disrupt our troop deployment, then launch an attack on the gates with their elite forces before rolling in with the armored infantry to pour troops into the breaches until we are all dead." The Fleshmaster considered Igdril's words. If the Unbound was right, and Jacaerus had no particular reason to doubt it, then it had been a brilliant plan, if utterly ruthless. The casualty rate during the descent of the drop troopers must have been horrendous, and even success would have seen them stranded in a fortress full of tens of thousands of enemy soldiers. Whoever had made the decision had probably signed the death warrant of the entire companies, perhaps the entire regiment. But given the losses the Imperium had already taken besieging the Hollow Mountain, Such a price would have been one any strategist worth his rank would have been entirely too willing to make for the chance of breaking the siege and ending the Battle of Beranos once and for all. There were more immediate issues at hand, however.
Why did you come all the way here?
We are not exactly close to the stratagem.
We are leaving,
replied the Unbound bluntly. Malone's orders are that you come with me to the stratagem, where we will rendezvous with him and the other evacuees before making for the extraction point. Congratulations, you are too valuable a resource to leave behind. The rest of the Fleshmasters are either dead or already in the fleet. Since there is a strong chance of us needing medical attention after we get out of here, I recommended we drag you along with us so you can patch us up if required. And with the enemy already inside the fortress, I thought it better to come get you in person. It's possible the Imperials have breached our communication lines through the fortress, and if they identify you as a person of importance it's unlikely you would make it to the stratagem. Igdal looked at the other Unbound in the room, still sluggish from their wounds. Some of them were still recovering, while others were putting on their equipment, which Jacaerys had brought to their beds before beginning his last gambit. The younger Astartes' helmet hid his face and his posture revealed nothing, but Jacaerys could guess what was going through the warrior's mind. He was considering whether to take the wounded with them, coldly weighing the pros and the cons. When the next sentence came on a private channel, the Fleshmaster knew what the result would be before Igdal even spoke. We are leaving them behind. With any luck, they will serve as a distraction. It frustrated the Fleshmaster to abandon his work, especially after he had expended rare resources to restore the Unbound to functionality, but Igdal was right. Without another word, the two of them left the room, leaving the Unbound to find their own fate in the doomed fortress.
What of the shield generators? Asked Jacaerys as they advanced.
Malone has sent the last of the Unbound there with orders to hold until death, along with the gladiators of the unsevered chain. They obeyed since that's where the fighting is guaranteed to be fiercest, the gods' cursed lunatics. Karkios designed the entire area to be a death trap. It will cost the Imperials a lot of lives and time before they can shut the generators down. But they will, sooner or later. Igdal shrugged. That's why we are getting out of here. At least we can be confident they won't flatten the mountain from orbit the moment the shields come down. There is a chapter master inside, and that isn't the kind of collateral damage their commanders will want on their hands. They will also want access to whatever records they can find, added Jacaerys. With the number of Inquisitors involved, they will be hungry for whatever scrap of information they can get their hands on. They walked at a brisk pace through the labyrinth of corridors. Running wasn't an option, as the siege had ramped up and the population of the Hollow Mountain had decreased. The amount of traps had been increased in proportion, and their helmet displays could only show them how to avoid them so quickly. Jacaerys followed Igdal. The Unbound was more aware of the latest changes in the stratagem's defenses than him. Eventually, they arrived before a locked reinforced door with a control panel next to it. Igdal placed his hand on the panel, letting his armor interface with its machine spirit and gesturing for Jacaerys to go through first. When the gate opened with his, the unique alterations of the Fleshmaster's own suit likely wouldn't play nice with the security. The gate would still open, but now was hardly the time to risk messing with the fortress defenses, mused Jacaerys. Something slammed into his back, and he stumbled. There was a moment of surprise, before the tip of a sword burst from his chest and the pain hit him, blossoming inside him like a star going nova. He felt his armor's altered machine spirit panic, sending a spike of meaningless impulses into his connection sockets as it felt him being wounded. Ah, he thought, realizing what had happened. That was quite well done. It was with a cold satisfaction that Igdal pulled his blade free of the Fleshmaster's back, the weapon running red with the blood of the legionary's two hearts. The strike had been perfectly angled to cut through both organs in one blow. He had repeated it many times in the training cages, using his authority to order the creation of customized targets based on biometric data he had pulled from the Unbound host's cogitators. All for that single moment, when a window of opportunity finally opened and he could take his long-delayed vengeance. Jacaerys wasn't dead yet, though. The Fleshmaster was hard to kill, even more so than a normal Astartes thanks to the mutations that had been bestowed upon him in the Wailing Storm. Igdal reached down and pulled the Fleshmaster's helmet off before throwing it away. He wanted to see his victim's face before he died. The Fleshmaster's visage was much as Igdal remembered it from when he had first seen it, glimpsing it in a rare moment where Jacaerys had removed his helmet. He had been floating within an amniotic tank then,
recovering from the latest round of surgeries that would elevate him from child to Astartes. Half delirious and mad with the images that had flowed through his fevered brain from the genetic memories being implanted into his flesh, he had seen the reptilian, noseless face staring at him from the other side of the glass. He had felt the same hatred then as he felt now, and it made his revenge all the sweeter. The dying man coughed, cold blood spilling from between his lips. "I am impressed," he rasped, staring up at his killer. "After all this time, I had truly forgotten that you despised me. You held your hand long enough to make me lower my guard. Well done." "I have been awaiting this moment for a long time," confessed Igdal, cold fury and relish mixed in his voice. "Ever since I faced you in the dark, amidst the ruin you had made of our homeland." Malone's hatred flared bright and dimmed soon enough, but I cultivated mine. "You are a fool if you think your brother has forgotten. But you and Malone have murdered billions in the last year alone," coughed Jacaerys along with another mouthful of blood. "Compared to such sins, what does what I did on Mula Secundus even matter?" "It matters to me," hissed the Unbound, a rare flare of emotion showing on his face. "All that we have done, all that we have become, finds its roots with you. You made us into monsters, Jacaerys, so it is only fitting that one of the monsters you created be the one to put you down." "You are right. I do not regret this end. But there is one thing you should know," the Fleshmaster rasped. "Malone's bloodline. I know you made him ascend using Ultramarine's gene seed, old man. I learned that long ago, did you forget?" "Of course, but he wasn't the only one on whom I used something special, my son." With trembling fingers, Jacaerys tapped his throat, where the secondary progenoid developed within the body of an Astartes, eventually harvested to allow the legion to grow beyond its initial numbers. Igdal's eyes widened in realization, then his face darkened in disgust. "I always wanted to see what you and Malone would accomplish together," wheezed the Fleshmaster. "It was curiosity, you see." "Another of your damned experiments?" spat Igdal. "Yes. I wanted to have a glimpse of what could have been." The Fleshmaster took one last, shuddering breath. "If Guilliman and Alpharaz had worked together. And you were magnificent." Jacaerys died with his eyes open, staring lifelessly into the face of the youth he had turned into a space marine using his own gene seed, and who had killed him for the crimes he had committed against his ruined home world. For several moments, Igdal remained standing, staring at the corpse lying before him. The sound of footsteps interrupted his reverie, and he drew his bolter, only to lower it as he recognized the humans arriving. They wore the uniforms of soldiers from Androka's Prime, led by that Lieutenant Malone had pulled from the field after burning that church dedicated to the Avenging Sun. "What was her name again?" "Report," he commanded, and the squad stopped dead and saluted. Even with their uniforms covered in grim and blood for the siege, the discipline ingrained over a lifetime spent in the shadow of a megalomaniacal demonic tyrant still held them in its thrall. "Lieutenant Lizandariety, my lord," said the woman. "We are patrolling this sector in search of enemy infiltrators." Igdal looked at the 10-odd mortals, noticing the good state and quality of their equipment and the way, even facing him, they were still keeping an eye on their surroundings. The lieutenant didn't appear overly intimidated by his presence either, which was rare among the saner servants of the Unbound host. Malone's instincts had served him well when he had promoted this one. "Not anymore, Lieutenant." He gestured toward the corpse at his feet. "As you can see, enemies have already made it this close to the stratagem. You will accompany me as we go there and ensure Lord Malone is safe." "As you command, my lord." "And what of the Lord Jacaerys?" It wasn't as stupid a question as it might sound. The Androcasians would have seen how hard it was to kill a space marine firsthand during the siege, and they would know that their transhuman masters could recover from wounds that would have ended a mere mortal instantly. "He is dead, and his killer has already fled." The blood on Igdal's power sword had been burned off by the energy field, not that the mortals would have dared say anything otherwise. "We must find Malone, now. The enemy is inside the wall, and he will be one of their priority targets." His brother had made sure of that, fighting on the front lines during the first weeks of the siege, rallying the other Unbound by slaying every space marine that made it to the walls. The Imperials knew Malone was in overall command of the Unbound host, and with his death, the entire host would collapse in on itself. Only a chosen of Archon could wield the authority and power needed to unify the bastardized legions of the lost and the damned along with the remaining Unbound, be they of the first or second generation. Of course, with the fall of the Hollow Mountain being now inevitable, the collapse of the Unbound host wouldn't mean much, but the death of a chosen would still be a great coup for the Imperials. And if they could capture Malone instead? No. It would not come to that. Igdal would make sure of it. They came across a squad of drop troopers before reaching the Stratagem, but the Imperial soldiers were already dead, butchered by Amai and buried in a wall that they had activated by rushing by it without pressing the appropriate stone next to it first. Lisande walked through the gory mess without blinking. She had seen much, much worse. She and her squad had been spared from frontline duty by the Lord Malone, who had used them as messengers and inner patrols instead, but they were from Androka's Prime. They had been the first to join the Unbound host, and had fought in the conquest of the Wailing Storm. As they approached the Stratagem, they started to hear the sounds of battle, and quickened their path, the humans struggling to keep up with Lord Igdal. The doors hung open, showing signs of having been breached by heavy explosives. They rushed inside, guns at the ready, Lord Igdal holding his sword and pistol in his hands. The command center was a corpse-filled wreck, with the bodies of heretics and servitors strewn all around along with a handful of scarlet-armored space marines. And there, pulling his sword from the chest of the last Red Hunter, clad in ornate, blood-splattered armor of black and gold and wearing a horned helmet, was the Unbound Lord himself. Igdal, breathed out Lord Malone as he saw the mentor. His helm briefly turned toward Lisande. Lieutenant Ariete. It is good to see you. Where is Jacaerus? He didn't make it, answered Igdal. Lisande remained silent. She had her suspicions as to the Fleshmaster's fate, but it wasn't her place to interfere in the affairs of the Forsaken Sons. A shame, sighed the Unbound Lord. Very well, it is time for us to abandon this place. More of these will be along soon. Give me a minute to finish things here. With a gesture, Lisande commanded her squad to take defensive positions. Lord Malone walked to one of the few consoles that remained intact and started working on it, bringing up a general channel. This is Lord Malone to all remaining forces of the Unbound host within the Hollow Mountain. The Stratagem has been lost. All restrictions on ammunition expenditure are lifted, announced Lord Malone, his words carried to the ears of every gun crew that still held their position, every army in the trenches, and every squad in the Hollow Mountain. By my order as chosen, all previous restraints placed upon Empiric capabilities are removed. Unleash hell, brothers and sisters. Let us make the dogs of the Corpse Emperor pay for their victory. With his last speech delivered, Malone pressed a few more runes on the console, until a garbled transmission emanated from it, in a language Lisande didn't recognize but which sent shivers of dread down her spine. There, he muttered as he pulled away from the console. Now, everyone, come with me. We are going to the teleportation chamber. Morkoth just confirmed the Blade of Terror is ready and waiting for us. What of the rest of our forces? It was only when all heads turned toward her that Lisande realized she had been the one to speak. For a moment, she wondered if she was going to die, slain out of hand for daring to question her lord. What of them, Lieutenant Ariete? Said Malone instead, sighing. They will die fighting, as they were always going to. The teleporter isn't rated for multiple successive transfers, so it's not as if we could take any more people with us. Now, follow me. We do not have much time. The teleportation chamber was in an area of the Hollow Mountain even more secure than the Stratagem, though that was probably due to the fact less people were supposed to access it on a daily basis. They passed through several false walls and secret passages before reaching it, and all the while, the sounds of battle across the Hollow Mountain grew louder. There were screams, human and inhuman, and the sound of explosives going off. With the last of their restraints removed by Lord Malone's last order, the Unbound host was unleashing the full horror of its might. Lisande knew that things would be even worse in the trenches, where the Dark Priests would be making their final offerings to the Dark Gods. Here we are, said the Unbound Lord as he entered a 20 digits code onto a panel hidden behind a wall carving depicting the throne world burning within the clawed hand of Horus Lupercal, the first Warmaster of Chaos. How the artwork had ended up here, Lisande had no idea. The architect of the Hollow Mountain surely hadn't put it there himself. The chamber was small, mostly occupied by a metallic disc engraved with a complex runic circle and linked to a series of interconnected devices that filled the rest of the room almost to capacity. Androka's Prime hadn't possessed any teleportation technology, but even so, Lisanne was certain what she saw now had little in common with what the Imperium used to send living beings across the warp. There were infernal carvings in the sides of the machines, and tubes more akin to fleshy veins carried blood and oil from one part to the next. Every individual component of the teleporter was connected to a cylindrical box attached to the ceiling directly above the platform. Through the gaps between the pulsating cables and the holes in the cover, Lisanne could see something spinning inside the box. She knew what it was, what it must be, and part of her wanted nothing more than to turn back and run as far away from it as possible, even if it led her directly into the guns of the Imperials. The Dark Magi of Argenta Primus were hardly secretive about what powered their machines. In fact, once you got them started you could hardly stop them talking about their home world's great accomplishments. So Lisanne knew that their technology was powered by drawing energy from the warp itself, somehow filtering the raw mudness of the Sea of Souls into something usable. The stuff of souls, made into a power source, it smacked of hubris even to her, who knew very little about technology and even less about theology. This was what the cylinder was, a miniature reactor, a hole in reality kept open by dark tech. "Don't look at it for too long," advised Malone. "It will drive you insane." There wasn't enough space to install all the proper shielding. It should be safe to stand next to for a while, but best not to take any chances. A dry cough drew Lysander's attention away from the device and back to the door. There stood Marcus the Riven. His crimson robe was covered in blood, and Lisanne doubted any of it was his. "Marcus," greeted the Lord Malone, sounding unconcerned by the Riven's arrival into this most secure and secretive of locations. "I see you made it." The Riven bowed. "It wasn't easy, Lord. I fear the Hollow Mountain will soon be in the hands of the foe." The Lord of the Unbound waved a hand dismissively. "It was always going to fall. What matters is that we successfully delayed the Imperial retribution into Azeroth. If we can escape to bring word of the enemy's strength back to Lord Archon, then we will have done our duty." "As you say, Lord," replied the Riven, bowing once more. "Get on the platform, all of you," commanded Malone, flipping a series of rune switches that turned up the apparatus, with a sound like a wet, hungry growl. "Are you sure about this, Lord?" asked Marcus, looking at the machine with concern. "This is Argentian technology. While I would never question the quality of our allies' work, their inventions have shown a tendency of unfortunate side effects." Malone shrugged. "If you have another way off-world, Marcus, I am all ears." When the Riven remained silent, he continued, "Our only choices are to die here fighting, or take the risk of using this device. It has been tested, you know. I'm not a fool. It will be unpleasant, but all of us should survive the journey." Obeying the orders of the Unbound Lord, they stood on the platform while Malone finished setting up the device, before joining them. The circle was barely large enough for all of them. Malone reached to take hold of a brass lever raised on the platform's edge. The Argentian warp reactor above their heads accelerated, and the cables spreading from it glowed through their shielding with a light of a color that did not belong to this side of the veil. "Gods be with us," said the Unbound Lord, and he pulled the lever. "You made it," said Morkoth. "I wasn't sure you would." Malone stood on the bridge of the Blade of Terror, gazing at the demonic display at the center of the room. Beranos 3 was growing more and more distant as the demon ship, along with the Eidolon of Regret and the rest of the Unbound host's decimated fleet, retreated toward the Mandeville Point. Imperial cruisers were detaching from the Retribution fleet in pursuit, but they wouldn't catch up to them in time. The engines of the Blade of Terror were roaring, and the displeasure of the demon ship at fleeing was palpable. Malone had passed by the remains of a dozen crew members on his way to the bridge from the teleportation chamber, freshly slaughtered in a myriad different ways by the vessel. The infernal sentience hadn't tried anything against him, of course, it knew better. Morkoth may be the vessel's current master, but Malone remembered when the display at the center of the bridge had been made of an actual hololith instead of flesh and blood. Alzarak's teleporter worked in the end, the Unbound Lord answered the fleet master. "Is everything all right on the Eidolon?" "He's still complaining about the resources they spent on providing the ammunition for the Hollow Mountain, but the ship should follow us when we leave the system. It's not as if they have anywhere else to go." "There is still the Zitherian system," pointed out Malone. "The bulk of the Argentian forces are there. He might want to join up with them instead of following us." "I don't think he can," said Morkoth. "I think his orders are more literal than that. He was told to accompany us and provide us with what we needed, and it's what he will do, even if he complains every step of the way. Malone mused on that. It was possible, he guessed. The Dark Mechanicum may claim that it had rejected the chains of its loyalist counterpart, but those who stood at the top were still very much willing to bind those under them into complete obedience by whatever means available. Al-Zarek had been given command of a forge barge. His masters wouldn't have wanted him to simply run off with it and start building his own empire with the resources and troops within. Warlords had accomplished that with much less. The lieutenant and the other survivors have been brought to the Apothecarian, said Igdal, stepping onto the bridge. The Medicae are confident they will be fine as long as they wake up sane and not screaming or drooling. Good. The mortals had been unconscious when they had manifested on the Blade of Terror, with several of them having gone missing during the transition. Malone didn't want to imagine their fates. The teleportation had been a disturbing experience to say the least. Though the Unbound hadn't suffered the same psychic damage as the Androcasians, their armor had still been damaged during the transit. Igdal's helmet had been shattered, and the face that was revealed sported scales and vertical irises, nothing too remarkable among the Forsaken Sons, but Malone recognized that particular pattern. Igdal. Your face. It turns out that we both must bear our father's sins, joked Igdal dryly. On his command throne, Morkoth inclined his head, sensing a private joke he wasn't included in. Malone's brother wouldn't normally have been so open with his secret. He too must still be shaken from the teleportation. We will reach the Mandeville Point in another 9 hours, announced Morkoth. Is it time for you to tell us where exactly we will be heading next, Malone? The graveyard, said the Unbound Lord, referring to the subsector of Azeroth that had been left completely devastated by the War of the Beast. We will reunite with Lord Arkan there, and he will be the one to give us our next target. Or, we could just leave, said Morkoth. The other two Unbound turned to face him, and the Fleetmaster shrugged. I am just saying that this is an option we have. There are a dozen paths we could take into Azeroth once we leave, and the Black Crusade is scattered across an entire sector and will face the Imperium's full might now that Beranos has fallen. We could sneak back into Imperial territory and raid and conquer while all eyes are turned on Azeroth. You speak treachery, said Malone softly. You have seen the fleets the Imperium is sending, pointed out Morkoth. And we all know the extent of the forces that emerged from the Wailing Storm. They are strong, but they are not strong enough. Sooner or later, the Imperium will crush the Black Crusade, just like they crushed the Unbound host here. And when that happens, we may not escape that time. You are wrong, replied Malone, and there was something haunted in his voice. You forget, I am one of Arkan's chosen. I was taken into his confidence. I know his plan for this war, what he hopes to find in the graveyard. If he succeeds, then it won't matter how many ships, how many armies, how many chapters the Imperium sends after him, nor where we run to escape his wrath. All who stand in his way shall perish. And if he fails? Asked Morkoth. Then we will die at his side, spitting our defiance at the rotting Imperium and spending our lives to hasten its inevitable demise. A better end than what would befall us should we break our oaths to the Awakened One and he succeed all the same. Azeroth Sector, Warworld Andros Rest. 745.m32. This outpost was occupied by the Dularkan 282nd when they turned renegade and attacked Inquisitor Alaric and his retinue. Is that correct, General? Yes. We purged the last elements of the 282nd when we retook the area after the Inquisitor departed. There were only a few of them, and not enough bodies to account for all of them. Later on, we encountered the rest of the regiment among the natives as they attacked us. We have managed to hold this outpost and others like it across the world, but pursuing the enemy in the woods is all but suicidal. The hostilities intensified after Inquisitor Alaric's departure? Not immediately. Once the turncoat elements were purged, the situation more or less calmed down. The Chaos Marines appeared around the time Silberstart fell, even if we didn't notice any ships arriving in the system. And what of the other Dularkan regiments deployed on this world? They all encountered the same fate as the 282nd. It was a ploy of the natives. They targeted all Dularkan regiments because of their traditions. There were other cases, but the heretics focused their efforts on those regiments. We learned from interrogating captured tribespeople that this was done at the behest of their angel with broken wings. Apparently, Their heretic priests had received visions marking those specific regiments as worthy of their master's favor. And how exactly did the natives corrupt the Tulakan? This outpost has a fresh source of water flowing from underground. When we retook the outpost, I suspected it may have been the contagion vector and sent a team to investigate. They found a shrine to the Chaos powers underground, as well as a tunnel the heretics had used to reach it. Inquisitor Alaric and his retinue drank from their own supplies during their time on the planet, and were unaffected while the regiment was driven insane. After we removed the heretical icons, I used prisoners sentenced to death for various offenses as test subjects. While I rationed our reserves of water, I made one prisoner drink from the sources every 5 days. When they stopped becoming violently insane, I stretched our reserves as far as I could, and eventually allowed our supply corps to use it again, after running it through every purifying technique we could think of and having our preachers bless it. And the other outposts where Tulakans were stationed? After we found the icons, I contacted the officers who retook them and warned them of what we had found. They discovered similar shrines near sources of water, food, and even in the air filtering machines in one case. That last one appeared to be the work of an inside traitor. At the moment, our best guess is that one of the guardsmen who returned from the front had been corrupted. I see. We will need to examine you and your men, General, to make sure that you do not bear any trace of the corruption. But you do realize that, even if your methods worked, you will still personally face judgment for exposing the souls of the God Emperor's subjects to corruption, even if they were criminals? I understand, Inquisitor. I welcome it. I pray that the Holy Order's judgment may cleanse my soul of guilt. A hand clad in silver-painted ceramite closed into a fist as the transmission ended. This was the only sign of emotion displayed by any of the 10 Grey Knights in the gunship as it finished its descent toward the jungles of Andros Rest, where the forces of the Imperium had been battling the local tribes for years before the Black Crusade had set the Azarok sector ablaze. "The Inquisitor is lying to them," said one of them over their shared Vox link. "None of them will be allowed to leave Andros Rest alive." They might be. There are plenty of battles left to fight in Azarok. Plenty of opportunities for the guardsmen deployed here to earn a worthy death fighting the Emperor's foes. The Inquisitor might decide against wasting the lives of other Imperial soldiers when there are those already condemned to death to send instead. That is for the Inquisitor to decide, brothers. Not us. Our task is restricted to the destruction of the entity leading the Chaos incursion on this world. They could all sense it, pressing on the wards of the aircraft and their own prodigious mental defenses. The veil between the Materium and the warp was thin, and growing thinner as the carnage across Andros Rest continued. We still don't know what started the contamination. During the War of the Beasts, the degeneration of the local inhabitants was fast, too fast. You don't expect nobles and their servants to be able to fight off an orc invasion, especially the kind of greenskins that appeared back then. Inquisitor Alaric was investigating that very possibility when the signs of the Black Crusade first appeared. He left the planet when he thought the source of the Tulakan soldiers' madness was linked to them rather than the world itself. That was a mistake. Yes. But we will not speak ill of the dead, brother. Andros Rest is one of the convergence points identified by the Supreme Grand Master. Whatever the Forsaken Sons seek to achieve here must be stopped at all costs. The war against the tribes and their turncoat guard allies is of secondary importance. It is a distraction, meant to hide the true purpose of this incursion. You think the angel with broken wings is our target, then? It is the most likely possibility, yes. And that makes the presence of the heirs of Sanguinius here concerning. For over 1,000 years, the chapters of Space Marines descended from Sanguinius had struggled to keep their shameful secret hidden from the Imperium, but the Grey Knights knew everything about the Red Thirst and the Black Rage. They had each read the intercepted reports sent from the Battle Brothers on Andros Rest to their officers, speaking of the struggle to contain these twin curses while fighting against the heretics alongside the Imperial Guard. There are over 100 heirs left on this world, and most of them will be fighting in the offensive on our target's estimated location. If we are lucky, they will be too far from the epicenter to be affected, but that isn't certain. Though the gunship was still high in the air, the Grey Knights began to hear the sounds of the battle raging below them, as well as perceive the psychic emanations from the conflict as thousands of Imperial soldiers advanced onto what orbital scans combined with psychic readings of the planet had revealed to be the likely location of the Forsaken Sons' base of operations on Andros Rest. Soon, they would know whether their theory was correct, whether this was indeed the fulcrum of this particular theater of the Black Crusade, the location of the threat Janus had foreseen. We are Hector Arnold. Once we were two, mortal and demon. But such a distinction means nothing anymore. Now we are one, unified in our blood-soaked devotion to the throne of skulls. The pyres of the wailing storm broke the two we were apart and welded the pieces together. We are the blood champion, chosen of Arkin. We are the death of worlds, the slaughterer of nations. We stand mightiest among the forsaken sons. In the uncounted thousands who have rallied to the banner of the chained demon head, there are none greater than us with a blade, none stronger or more resilient. We are a broken thing. Our wings, which once spread wide and dark, were ripped from us by the steel wrought in his last act of defiance before death claimed him. All that remain from them are splinters of bone jutting from our back, blood endlessly dripping from the rent in our fused armor and flesh. We were born of the storm, and we bring it with us whenever we go. The earth of this world cracks and bleeds under our feet. The skies scream and the dark jungles twist and burn without end. This is good. This is as it should be. This world, it calls to us, even in its slumber. It knows bloodshed of old. It remembers the war before all wars, a conflict of vast and terrible even we can barely glimpse its echoes in the sea of souls. Violence, madness, slaughter. The slaves of the corpse god tried to cage it with a name, to bind its true nature with their pretty words and to make it a place of peace, but the world remembers. When the war cry of the beast reached this world, it awakened its memories. Those who pursued their petty pleasures in isolation drowned in dreams of antediluvian carnage, and were reborn as true servants of the Lord of Skulls. With his blessing, they purged this world of the greenskin tide, and when the slaves of the corpse god came, they continued to fight. But as the echoes of the beast's great cry faded, so too did the world's memories. They linger still, in the deep bones of the earth, yet as they diminished so too did the tribes. Then we came. Rage calls to rage, blood calls to blood. Our arrival sent ripples through time, and the shamans heard our footsteps long before we departed the wailing storm. They prepared the way for us, marking those worthy of service to the Lord of Skulls and culling the rest. They offered their own blood along with the skulls of their foes to open a path on which we and the other second-born walked. With our chains removed, we slaughtered and laughed, we reveled in this unfettered carnage. And when the world answered, we followed its voice here, to these ruins that were old when humanity first climbed out of the slime. Others of the forsaken sons joined us, following other paths through the sea of souls. Diabolists, their armor covered in runes and prayers. The spawn of the dark gods cling to the trails of their souls, waiting for them to cut apart the veil and let them manifest. They too seek to place their words upon the truth of this world, to make its primal simplicity into something they can understand. They will fail, but their attempts nudge the world ever closer to awakening. The war raging around us also helps stir the world awake. The slaves of the corpse god have found us, and in spite of their ignorance they sense that they must stop us. From their limited point of view, they are right to fear. But it is only their ignorance that makes them rush toward us. Soon, they will understand, for we know where we are. It does not matter that the writing in the stone has faded, that nothing remains but smooth rock and dust. Time means nothing to the warp. All that has been, all that will be, is. There is no breaking the pattern, no eluding the inevitable. The galaxy has burned, burns, and will burn, forever and ever. Blood and doom are the only constants in this universe. We laugh at the thought, throwing our head backward to stare at the sky. And there, we see a glimpse of silver, and we laugh harder. For we know what this portends. We remember the words the awakened one whispered to us before we were sent to this world. We remember the question he asked of us. They are coming, we howl, and the mewling, chittering hordes that have massed around us like moss around a stone screech in response to a voice. Prepare yourselves, brothers. Blood for the blood god. Skulls for the skull throne. The gunship descended, and the Grey Knight's perception of the power accumulating below became clearer. Through the psychic mist of bloodshed, they finally saw the shadow of their quarry, a vast figure of power and carnage with broken wings, towering above the battlefield with a great demonic axe in its hands. On the ground, guardsmen fighting the cultists saw the silver aircraft, and rejoiced at the arrival of reinforcements. This is the place, one of the warriors sent to his brothers telepathically. The other 9 sent back the psychic equivalent of a nod of approval. This is our target, Nebula of Retribution, the Justico called out to the ship in orbit that had carried the squad to this world from the Beranos system. We have confirmation of the coordinates. Open fire. Hundreds of kilometers above, a single shell was loaded into the main gun of the inquisitorial vessel. It was not ammunition typically used by the Imperial Navy, for its applications in space combat were limited. It had been designed by the tech priests indentured to the Holy Order, each instance of its design crafted according to exacting specifications so that they could only be fired by the ship for which they were meant. It was a necessary safety precaution, for within that shell was confined the burning wrath of the God Emperor. The gun aimed and fired, and the shell descended through the atmosphere of Andros Rest like a streaking comet. It hit the ground in the middle of the ruins where Imperials and heretics were battling, and unleashed a fiery apocalypse upon that battlefield. Chemical components salvaged from workshops dating back to the Dark Age of technology were mixed and ignited by devices built from schematics no one living truly understood, and a storm of flames spread outward from the point of impact. It engulfed cultists and guardsmen alike, making no distinction between those faithful to the Golden Throne and those whose ancestors had been turned from the righteous path by the madness that had descended upon Andros Rest during the War of the Beast. The ancient stones reddened and cracked under the sudden increase in temperature, and the remnants of structures that had withstood the passage of eons tumbled down as their supports were melted to slag. Within fireproof suits of ceramite, the heirs of Sanguinius watched in silent horror as soldiers they had fought alongside for months were incinerated in seconds. Diabolists clad in black and gold warplate cursed as their pawns and sacrifices were taken from their grasp. They could not even offer up the souls of those consumed by the blaze to the ruinous powers, for the incendiary bomb had been blessed with one of the Emperor's own divine tears, and its shell forged from metal cooled within holy water and covered in seraphic invocations. This power was not enough to affect the possessed Marines who had been scattered among the mortals beyond an unpleasant tingling, but it had effectively deprived the Forsaken Sons of a large chunk of their resources on Andros Rest in one single strike, while also crippling their aims on the war world. Yet few would have called it a victory. Clouds of black ash filled the air, blocking sight and making thermal imagery completely useless. Within that fog of the dead, the Second-born were drawn to their remaining foes by senses beyond mortal ken. Their bloodlust, already considerable from the fighting, was heightened even further, and they fell upon the heirs of Sanguinius, forcing the Space Marines into a desperate fight for survival. Overcome by the sudden demise of their allies and the onslaught of the possessed Marines, several of the heirs succumbed to the curse of the gene line, slipping into the black rage as their surroundings faded from view, replaced by images of the vengeful spirit in the fateful confrontation between Sanguinius and Horus Lupercal. They roared their hatred in response to the Second-born's own howls, and met their attack with equal fury. And at the center of the scorched ruins, surrounded by the ashes and blackened bones of his mortal followers, the Blood Champion laughed in a singular and terrible voice. There is fire all around us, and the scent of burning flesh and wood. The last scream of the humans is silenced as the air within their lungs burn, while amidst the inferno our mortal brothers stand untouched, wreathed in auras of power as they attempt to draw upon the torment and death our foes have unleashed. And they fail, one by one. There is something to this inferno beyond mere fire. The flames lick at our armor before dying out for lack of fuel, and though they do not burn us, we still feel pain at their kiss. There is something of the anathema in this weapon our foes have deployed, and though it threatens to ruin all that we seek to accomplish, we cannot help but laugh. This can still be salvaged, O Mighty One, one of the Diabolists calls to us from what he thinks is a safe distance. Fool. It does not matter how close or far he is, all that keeps him from our wrath are the runes etched upon his armor and daubed in the blood of the Awakened One himself, willingly given at the dawn of the Black Crusade. If these interlopers are slain, we can bring in more tribesmen from elsewhere on the planet and continue our work. We do not answer. We do not need to. The silvery gunship opens fire as it descends, and the Diabolist is silenced as high-caliber rounds pierce through his armor and turn him to pulp. The side doors of the gunship open, and from them jump 10 warriors in silver-clad, wielding halberds and sword that blaze with anathema fire. We roar and lift our axe, and our lesser brethren heed our call. As we charge toward the leader of the Silver Warriors, the one whose soul burns brightest of all, the Second-born come upon them as well. At last, a worthy foe. The possessed Marines who attacked the Grey Knights outnumbered their foe 3-1. Even with the support of the gunship hovering above them, this was a numerical advantage that, combined with the dark gifts their unholy communions with the Neverborn had bestowed upon them, would have seen ordinary space marines overcome in moments. But those were no mere space marines. They were Grey Knights, the sons of Titan. Every trace of human weakness had been hammered out from them through decades of training harsher than anything a space marine aspirant ever went through. Their mortal identities bled from them through treatments that could not be called anything else than torture. With nemesis blades the Grey Knights stood their ground against the possessed, while their leader, haloed in seraphic light, charged through the ash-clouded ruins and toward the towering shape whose infernal glow could be seen even through the smoke. The Justicar raised his blade just in time to turn aside a mighty blow, as the Blood Champion struck with its demonic axe. The weapon hit the scorched earth, biting deep into soil and stone before the Chosen of Archon ripped it free in a shower of rock shards. As it did so, it swiped at its foe with its free hand. The Grey Knight stepped back, and the tip of the Blood Champion's claws barely scratched the blessed ceramite. Smoke rose from where the armor had been touched, as it did from the Blood Champion's fingertips. Titan's son. It roared, eyes blazing with eldritch fire. Tell me, which blood is it that flow through your veins? Do your ancestry lies with those who remain bound, or those who broke their oaths to their masters to kneel before the false emperor once more? Only the emperor's gift runs through my flesh, demon, spat the Justicar, his sword coming up for another blow, aimed at the Blood Champion's leg. It bit deep, cutting through warped ceramite, muscle and bone in one swoop. Blood gushed from the wound, and the Blood Champion stumbled, but remained standing. Is that what they told you? It sneered, striking again. That you and your brothers sprung whole from the corpse god's loins? Surely your slave masters must be subtler than this. This time the Justicar dodged the axe blow entirely, but wasn't fast enough to avoid the kick that the Blood Champion unleashed in his direction with its wounded leg. Even with the damage it had suffered, there was plenty of strength in the blow that hit the Grey Knight square in the chest, sending him flying back and crashing on the ground, lifting a cloud of ash. Ripping its axe free of the earth once more, the Blood Champion limped toward its fallen foe. As it advanced, it swirled the monstrous weapon like a mortal man might a rapier, and it cut the air with a sound like the screams of innocence. You are not so different from us, it continued. You are space marines into which something more was poured, and it burned away everything you were until only the instrument of a power was left. The only difference is that the God we serve does not lie to us like yours. And while the false emperor hoards his power on his hollow throne, Khorne is most generous with his. The Blood Champion stood, towering above the fallen Justicar, and raised its demonic axe. When this world awakens, it proclaimed, all who stand upon it shall receive the blessing of mighty Khorne. As it was before when the beast walked the stars, they shall witness the glory of the skull throne, and be reborn in blood and doom eternal. The Blood Champion smiled as it looked down upon the Justicar, blood running freely from its glowing jaw. We wonder, will you and your brothers be reborn too? We are Grey Knights, shouted the Justicar, rising to his feet. No evil shall ever touch us, for the Emperor's gift is proof against all such blandishments. Then you will die, roared the Blood Champion, and it brought its axe down. In that moment, the Justicar, who had been telepathically linked with the rest of his squad, each warrior amplifying the other's precognitive powers, saw his opening, his chance to end the threat that had been foreseen by the Supreme Grand Master. It was small, for all that he had wounded the monster before him and taken little damage in return so far. The creature would only grow stronger as the confrontation went on, for such was the way of the Blood God's servants. The Justicar abandoned all thoughts of defense or dodging. As the axe came down, he pushed forward, focusing all of his own psychic might and all that he could draw from his battle brothers into his nemesis sword. The blade ignited like a caged star, and as the Blood Champion's weapon tore through ceramite and flesh, the Justicar's sword plunged into its chest. The seraphic power charged within the blade met the infernal energy saturating the Blood Champion's body, and the two forces, anathema to one another, detonated. The Blood Champion was hurled off its feet as arcs of pure warp energy leapt from it and buried themselves into the ground, turning the ash to black glass where they earthed themselves. The Justicar's left arm hit the ground a second later, severed at the shoulder by the Blood Champion's last blow. But though it had come at a price, the Justicar now stood over the broken form of the Blood Champion, his sword still held in his right hand, bloodied but victorious. The other Grey Knights rallied to their leader. They had triumphed over their foe, slaying the Diabolists and the Second-Born who had broken from fighting the heirs of Sanguinius to come to their chosen lord's assistance. They, too, had suffered for their victories, their armors were rent and blood flowed from cursed wounds, and one of them had to be carried by another, rendered half unconscious by a blow that had all but eviscerated him. Still, despite the grievous injury dealt to it, the Blood Champion stirred. The demon with which he who had been Hector of the 12th Legion had been joined had been mighty even at the time of their union, and had grown even stronger as it feasted upon the plentiful slaughters of the Forsaken Sons. Already the possessed lord's wounds were closing as it drew upon its power to repair the damage that had been inflicted upon it. But the Grey Knights would not give it the chance to finish healing itself. Methodically, with an ease come from centuries of practice, they set to the grim business of dispatching their foe. Our body is broken. They cut off our arms and shattered our legs. Our spine is severed in 3 different places, and there is a bolt round in our skull, kept from exploding merely by our own will. They stand in a circle around us now, reciting insipid prayers that still hold enough strength to burn us. Do they know where those words they speak first came from? We are already dead, and we know it. At long last, the death we inflicted upon so many has come for us too. As we knew it would. As we knew it must. As we know it should. And yet, we struggle still. We defy the Reaper, holding the end at bay with howling rage. We laugh in their perfect faces, hidden beneath their helms. They do not appreciate it. They stop their little chant. It is over, monster, one of them shouts at us. Your scheme has failed. Your power is broken. Over? It is never over, little knights. The slaughter will never end. The blood god wills it so. It is the Emperor's will that shall prevail. All your foul gods will perish, in the end, and the galaxy shall be cleansed of their impurity. There is such certainty in his voice. Such belief. He truly believes in what he is saying, this machine of metal and flesh that thinks itself a man. But he is wrong, and we will make him see before we die. It is this galaxy's purpose to bleed. We roar to the skies, throwing our head back. It is the nature of every living thing to fight and die. You cannot deny Khorne his victory, little witch. He has already won. He won from the moment the first ape-like human picked up a rock and used it to bash in his brother's skull. The entire species, the entire galaxy, belongs to him. The Corpse Emperor is nothing but a pretender who tried to deny reality, and failed. We smile. But you understand this, don't you? You, who rained fire and death upon us, uncaring of those who were caught in the flames of your judgment. You know that only death can move the stars, that blood is the only currency that matters in this broken universe we inhabit. There truly is nothing left of human in you, isn't there, abomination? The knight spits, his words laden with contempt. Nothing left of whoever you were before you gave yourself to the ruinous powers. Just like the rest of these Forsaken Sons, you have abandoned everything that once made you worthy of fighting in the Great Crusade. Something flares inside us, some emotion we haven't felt in a long time. It was the Emperor who forsake us. It was him who lied to us, who deceived us and made us die for his ambition, for his dream. It was a pretty lie, the Great Crusade. To claim that there was something more than bloodshed to existence, but it was only ever a convenient lie the false emperor used to manipulate us. He knew, even then, that only through war could his vision be realized. We laugh again, even though there is little joy left. This world knows the truth. We would have shown it to you, to all of you. The knight does not say anything more. He walks to us, and plunges his sword into our chest once more, right next where it struck us first. We feel its tip pierce through our armor skin and into the warped bones and organs under it. It burns us with a hateful fire, and we feel the strands of our existence snap one by one. We cannot hold on. We try to lash out, to bite at his throat with our teeth, the only weapon left to us. But he is strong, and our strength has been broken. All we manage is to make the sword dig deeper, and our blood flows from the wound. This, too, is pleasing to Khorne, we know. We have always known, from the moment the nails were pounded into our skull. War cares not for whence the blood flows, only that it does. Why should Khorne be any different? We are Hector Hecaran, and this is our death. Please, let this be our death. 15 hours later, the nebula of retribution reached the system's Mandeville point and vanished into the warp. On its way there, it did not answer the hails of the other Imperial forces demanding an explanation for their actions, and the callous slaughter of thousands of Imperial guardsmen. Even the furious demands of the heirs of Sanguinius, whose warriors had reached the center of the scorched ruins with their blades red with second-born blood only to find the swiftly decaying corpse of the angel with broken wings they had spent months hunting, were met with silence. Knowledge of the event was swiftly suppressed. The death of the guardsman was attributed to a last-ditch weapon employed by the heretics in order to avenge the death of their leader, the so-called angel with broken wings. Any questioning this or bringing up the last transmissions from the battle zone, speaking of a silvery aircraft seen above, were quickly silenced by pale-faced commissars. The leaders of the heirs of Sanguinius received a letter, sealed under marks not seen by any of their blood since the chapter's foundation. The letter was burned after reading, and the Space Marines, too, put the matter behind us, regardless of the shame they felt in doing so. In the days to come, the tide of the war on Andros Rest would turn in the favor of the Imperium once more, as the tribes withdrew from the front lines and back into the jungle, fleeing from the heirs now that they had no counter to the Space Marines' might. Soon, the chapter's officers met with those of the Imperial Guard, and informed them that they needed to leave the war world. Now that the situation there was back under control, the spear of the Adeptus Astartes was required elsewhere in the Azeroth sector. The only trace that the Nebula of Retribution had left, beyond the scorched earth where the antediluvian ruins had stood, were the inquisitorial personnel now deployed alongside the Imperial regiments. With the destruction of the Blood Champion, the cases of warp-related insanity among the troops had swiftly diminished. Eventually, the lead Inquisitor decided that they would continue to observe as the Imperial Guard fought against the tribes of Andros Rest. There were tens of thousands of guardsmen left on the planet, and while they could do much good elsewhere in Azeroth, the possibility they might be compromised meant that it was best to simply leave them on Andros Rest for now. Of course, this wasn't the explanation given to the officers and passed down to the troops. Instead, the faithful soldiers of the God Emperor were told that though the schemes of the tribes had been broken by the Space Marines, their defiance of his will could only be met with total eradication. Only when the heretics were completely wiped out would the Guard withdraw from Andros Rest. Whether such a cleansing would be achieved by the strength of the Guard or unleashed from the heavens as exterminatus was yet to be decided. Azeroth Sector, Shrine World Nereus Sanctus. 745.M32. Just enough remained visible of Nereus Sanctus past as the capital of the local ecclesiarchical diocese to make its current state all the more horrifying. Karalit, once a dark apostle of the Word-Bearers Legion, now Lord of Ash and one of Arkhan's chosen, had come to the world more than a year before the beginning of the Black Crusade. Through the use of sorcery, he had inspired the creation of a cult among the minor clans that worked the asteroid fields near the system's edge. Their assistance had allowed him to cross the warp and arrive to Nereus Sanctus months before Arkhan unleashed the Black Crusade upon the sector. The Dark Apostle had slipped onto Nereus Sanctus unseen, and begun to use the skills he had sharpened during the conquest of the Wailing Storm. Rarely had the Lord of Ash, working together with Dekaros, the Lord of Shadow, needed to wage war to conquer the worlds they had brought under the Forsaken Sun's aegis. Theirs were more subtle methods, and Karalit used every trick he had learned during his time in the 17th Legion and perfected since on Nereus Sanctus. The sacrifice of the planet's cardinal to the ruinous powers, combined with the desecration of the tomb of Saint Nereus, had been enough to open the first breach in the veil and unleash a host of demons upon the great cathedral that had served as the world's administrative and religious center. Thanks to the subversion of Inquisitor Gaeli's servitors, the evil of the Lord of Ash had gone unopposed. The astropaths had been silenced, all traffic coming out of the system had stopped, with pilgrim vessels and tithe transports being assaulted right after emerging from the warp by the now thoroughly corrupted minor clans. The sheer size of the Imperium had played in favor of Karalit there, as it would have taken much longer before anyone noticed the silence of even a shrine world. Sorcerous wards woven across the entire system by his followers had kept the disturbances in the ether from spreading too much, and by the time the Imperium realized something had gone wrong, it was far too late, and the sector had other problems to deal with. Statues of Imperial saints the size of titans had been cast down or defaced, and in their place blasphemous monuments to ruin had been raised by cultists and slaves. Not that there was much distinction between the two groups after a few months of exposure to Karalit's dark works. The natives of Nereus Sanctus had been broken, their minds scoured by the awful things the Dark Apostle and his minions had unleashed upon their once pristine world. No longer did they pray to the God Emperor, dedicating their every breath to him on earth with the habit of generations. Now they sacrificed at the altars of chaos, shedding blood and sweat to continue in their work. City-sized gardens carefully tended to by generations of devout worshippers so that the trees and flowers formed the emblems of long-dead heroes had been burned and despoiled, their greenery transformed into fetid marshes infested with disease-carrying vermin. The streets of the world's single city had run red with blood offered to chaos with the stolen weapons of dead martyrs. The roads of contemplation and wonder walked by pilgrims were now marked by the crucified corpses of tens of thousands of imperial priests, their tortured souls bound to their bodies by unholy sorcery so that their torment could continue. Small chapels and monasteries dotted across the shrine world's surface had been destroyed or transformed into darker temples to the ruinous powers. In the wailing storm, the Lord of Ash had dreamt of a distant world, where the father he had abandoned lurked in brooding exile. For all that Karalit despised the weakness of Lorga, he had found those visions of Sicarius beautiful, and sought to make Nereus Sanctus into a reflection of that most unholy of demon worlds. His vision was well on its way to becoming reality, but sundering the veil separating reality from the immaterium would take more than the desolation already unleashed. Once the last pockets of resistance had been destroyed and the last temple of the false emperor replaced by a monument to chaos, the true conquest of Nereus Sanctus had begun. The initial site of the demonic incursion, the grand cathedral where the cardinal of Nereus Sanctus had lived and addressed his people for centuries, had been remade into a temple to the primordial pantheon. The sections that had burned in the original incursion had been built anew, consecrated according to dark auspices. There, demons walked freely, feeding on the despoiled faith that permeated every blood-soaked stone. Each of the cathedral's four wings was consecrated to one of the dark gods, and served as the domain of a high priest of that god. The Lord of Ash had selected each of them from the throngs of followers of chaos, looking for the signs of the ruinous power's favor and reading the skeins of their fates to ensure they would suit his purpose. It was these four apostles of ruin that directed the dark ceremonies meant to attract their patron god's favor, while in the cathedral's central sanctum, Karalit wove the eldritch energies that flowed across all of Nereus Sanctus. The rituals had been ongoing for weeks, and Nereus Sanctus was slipping closer to the realms of chaos with every passing day. The warp spread from the cathedral like a tide of madness, with the lesser temples of ruin that it reached serving as relays to its corruption. Soon, the cultists whispered to each other. Soon, the Neverborn roared on the other side of the veil. Soon, thought the Lord of Ash as he beheld all that he had wrought and smiled. Soon. The knights in silver who came to Nereus Sanctus knew little of what had transpired on the shrine world before. Their information was fragmentary, formed of the reports of the remaining inquisitorial presence in the Azeroth sector and the divinations of their own leaders. They did not know, for instance, that Gaeli's servitors had not betrayed the Imperium willingly. They did not know the horrors that the Lord of Ash had visited upon the Inquisitor in order to turn him. Nor did they know just how soon the Dark Apostle had come to Nereus Sanctus and begun his dread work. But they did know that they didn't have much time. They could feel the pulsating power of the warp, growing stronger with every beat of the ritual's blasphemous heart. All 19 of them had sworn to prevent that potential evil from reaching dreadful actualization, sworn before the Supreme Grand Master himself, as the Grey Knights scattered across Azeroth to deal with the fires lit by the Awakened One while Lord Janus went to confront the Chaos Lord responsible for it all. They stood in a circle marked by the absence of one of their own, a brother they had lost before the call to gather at Azeroth had been sent, with no time to journey to Titan to fill the void. Around them, tech priests worked frenetically, reciting hymns to the machine god and making the final preparations for what needed to be done. The warship Sliver of Atonement had managed to reach orbit unseen, her stealth systems proving more than capable of dealing with the auspexes and witches of the flotilla of transports and cult ships that drifted above Nereus Sanctus. She hovered thousands of kilometers above the nexus of warp energy that, according to their maps, had once been the planet's foremost cathedral. She could not get further down, nor could the gunships in her hangar be trusted to cross through the eldritch storms raging across the atmosphere. There was no time for elaborate plans or investigation, and the Sliver lacked the armaments required to pierce through the planet's warp-laced atmosphere and obliterate the root of the corruption from orbit. The Grey Knights would have to resort to the kind of desperate assault against all odds that very rarely ended well, but it was for that kind of warfare that they had been created. And so, teleportation, Never a perfectly reliable method of transportation, even under the best of etheric circumstances and with the relic technology available to the Knights of Titan, using it to pierce through the storms and the infernal wards woven in the Chaos Cathedral was going to be a trial like few others. But there was no choice, not if the Grey Knights were to have any chance of stopping the ritual before its dreadful climax. And so they stood, divided in 4 quarters of a circle, holding their sacred creed in their minds as a shield against madness and corruption. The tech priests had worked wonders in the few hours since the Grey Knights had discerned the ritual's pattern, and managed to divide the destination of the teleport. Through 5 of them had wiped their own minds to expiate the shame of what they had needed to do to the sacred machine in order to make it possible. Finally, all preparations were complete. A lever of brass encrusted with cogs was pulled, there was a flash of light, and the 19 Grey Knights were gone, save for one, whose body was spread across the entire platform, armor and flesh broken and ground together by the enormous energies unleashed. Those same energies left entire sections of the machine in ruin, and over 20 priests and servitors dead in spite of the shielding that covered them. But the 18 surviving Grey Knights all made it to their destination, which was miraculous in itself. Whether it would be enough, however, remained to be seen. Close to the nexus of warp energy on Nereus Sanctus, things like directions and space tended to lose their meaning, replaced by intent and power. But before Karalit had ever come to the Shrine World, bringing illumination and ruin in equal measure, the cathedral's wing which had been dedicated to Khorne had been turned northwards. The screams and clashing blades were so loud that the thunderclap of 5 Grey Knights teleporting in went almost unheard. The shrieks of outrage of the bloodletter who first noticed their presence, quickly followed by a single shot that ended its incarnation and splattered its boiling vitae onto the already defiled floor, however, were heard by all. All ranged weapons were forbidden within the arenas of the Slaughter Prince, for melee combat was the one aspect of war most sacred to Khorne. A roar of fury rose from hundreds of throats at the Grey Knight's blasphemy. From the 8 pits that had been carved into the floor, where crazed Fraterus Templars battled with bestial mutants and skinless Neverborn amidst the dug-out bones of long-dead priests, those who spilled blood for Khorne sensed the blood god's displeasure. Atop his altar of skulls, the mutant warlord who was named Perdiccas, the Slaughter Prince, spat a command in the degenerate low-Gothic dialect of his warp-torn home world. Less than 1 cultist in 10 understood the debased language, but the intent behind it was clear to all of them. They screamed their own prayers to Khorne, and charged, heedless that the foe was taller and mightier than them by far, for they were lost to the rage of the god of war, and he cared not whence the blood flowed. Within seconds, the Grey Knights found themselves under attack. First came the cultists who had been watching the arena fights with rapturous fervor, a howling mob that crashed against the silver ceramite only to be cut down by nemesis blades in droves. These wretches were little more than chaff, found worthy only to add their mind-blasted devotion to the strength of the ritual battles. The Grey Knights slaughtered them by the score, barely slowing in their advance toward the center of the vast room, where stood the altar of skulls of the Slaughter Prince. The Sons of Titan had immediately recognized it as the center of this particular branch of Nereus Sanctus' great ritual. But soon enough, the actual fighters and champions of Khorne joined in the fray, having climbed out of the pits where they had dueled for the blood god's favor. Hulking mutants and warriors clad in crimson warplate, monsters with teeth of steel and claws dripping with gore, all heeded the will of their dark priest and hurled themselves at the intruders in their midst. These were more powerful foes, and while none were the equals of the Grey Knights, they were far more numerous. To defeat these greater heretics with haste, the Grey Knights began to draw upon their psychic might, only to find that access to the tumultuous font of energy that was the warp was dulled. Even though the veil between reality and the immaterium was thinning by the heartbeat, this section of the corrupted cathedral was dedicated to Khorne, who abhorred sorcery in all its forms. While this ruinous benediction could not block them completely, the Grey Knights' abilities were hampered, and they were forced to rely on blade and bolter to fight off the gladiators. The first Grey Knight to fall succumbed to a blow from a cultist who had once knelt before the image of him on earth and been anointed as a war leader of the Fraterus Templars. His power maul, covered in sigils daubed in blood, smashed through the ceramite helm of the Son of Titan and pulped the skull within. The cultist was immediately slain by another of the Grey Knights, but the loss of their battle brother disrupted their formation. All momentum was lost, and they were forced to stand back to back, surrounded by a growing bulwark of corpses. Slowly, the Slaughter Prince walked down the altar of skulls, his every step crushing bone underfoot. Perdiccas was tall, but unlike many devotees of Khorne, his frame was spindly. His body was clad in a suit of iron covered in vicious hooks made to tear through the skin of his foes and cover him in their blood. In his hands he held two short swords with jagged edges, one made of bone and the other of black stone. Even in the throes of bloodlust, the cultists parted before Perdiccas, who came face to face with the Grey Knights. His blades clashed with the edge of a nemesis sword, and for a moment the Chosen of Khorne strained against the Emperor-given strength of the Grey Knight that wielded it, the air crackling with the confronting powers of these two champions' patrons. Then Perdiccas smiled, and his tongue leapt out of his mouth, striking through the Grey Knight's eye lens. Its barbed tip pierced through the helmet and stabbed into the warrior's brain, killing him instantly. The Slaughter Prince laughed as his mutated tongue returned to his mouth, and he tasted the brain matter of the son of Titan. It burned him, for the flesh of every Grey Knight was permeated with the Emperor's grace, but he did not care. The fall of their brother energized the four remaining Grey Knights, who suddenly turned toward the Slaughter Prince. Moving with such speed that the champions they faced were caught by surprise, they ran the Khornate priest through, two of their nemesis blades piercing his guard and skewering his flesh before a third severed his head. Yet in the moment before the final blow, the Slaughter Prince called upon his bloody-handed god, and was granted one final boon. His arm bent and twisted as a new articulation formed, and his sword of stone plunged through the hearts of one of the Grey Knights holding him impaled. Though they had slain the Chosen of Khorne, the remaining Grey Knights had exposed themselves to the now fully enraged gladiators. The slaughter that followed was nearly total, and only one Grey Knight survived the brutal melee, his armor covered in blood and rents as he forced himself onward, toward the dread nexus of the chaos ritual unfolding across Nereus Sanctus. The arched ceilings of the cathedral's southern wing were filled with multicolored smoke from 100 incense burners. Powders made of crushed human organs and plants that grew under the light of warp-tainted stars burned or were ingested by the hundreds of debased Slayer-Inashi cultists who laid upon ornate cushions, lost to the depths of excess, their minds wandering into dark places and occasionally catching a glimpse of the youngest god's silver palace. There was not a single insect or vermin in the entire wing of sensations. A mere sniff of the smoke was enough to make them collapse on the spot, their tiny hearts bursting. Even the cultists of Slaanesh who gathered there to worship the Dark Prince could not last long before their own bodies collapsed. Demonettes danced in the smoke, and the sound of their laughter echoed across the hall in unearthly ways as they caressed the skin of passed-out cultists with their claws, waiting for the moment of their death so that they could feast on their sin-laden souls. When four Grey Knights teleported in from the Sliver of Atonement, the sparks of their arrival set the fog aflame. The firestorm engulfed the entire wing, burning hundreds of insensate cultists to death, while others were dragged from their stupor by the agony of being scorched alive. The demonettes screamed in outrage as the symbolism of the fog's inflammation, combined with the flames themselves, destroyed their incarnations and sent them shrieking back to the realms of chaos. Flames remained after the initial explosion, and in that inferno the surviving cultists hurled their charred bodies at the silver-clad warriors in their midst. Laughter and cries of devotion came out of burned throats, and they struck with daggers and whips that had dripped with the blood of their wielders not long ago. It wasn't enough. The cultists' weapons shattered against the Grey Knight's blessed war plate, and the four sons of Titan cut down the slaves of ruin without pause, advancing at speed toward the center of the dark cathedral. Even when black-skinned Neverborn rose from the burned corpses of the dead, demons that had been born from the madness of men who, in ages past, had come to relish the sensation of burning themselves and others, the Grey Knights did not pause. Not, at least, until they came before the altar of Slaanesh and the creature that presided over it. The drug-addled cultists called their high priest it that Slithers. It had an actual name, but none of them could speak it, and merely hearing it that Slithers speak it aloud was enough to send mere mortals into convulsions, something to do with the way its many mouths spoke in sound waves human ears were not meant to listen to. The Lord of Ash had found the creature amidst the tombs of its people, desecrating their remnants in ever more perverse ways to earn the favor of Slaanesh. For 6 days and nights as measured on old Earth, the Dark Apostle had fought at that Slithers, pitting his own knowledge of the demonic against that of the mutated monster. It had surrendered eventually, laughing in ecstasy at the sheer pleasure of battle after untold eons with only the dead for company. Now that Slithers reared back its reptilian head, discarding the cloaks of human leather sewn with golden thread that had covered its form, and hissed at the Grey Knights marching toward it. The sound of it echoed across the room, and a fresh host of Neverborn emerged in response to this call. The Grey Knights found themselves surrounded on all sides, but their blades cut through the tide of pale, sensual, infernal flesh without pause as they carved a path up the steps of pristine marble leading to the altar's top. One of the knights was cut off from his brothers when a horror with skin made of fingernails and eyes that glowed with the madness of tyrants fell from the ceiling, crashing into the warrior and bringing him down for a single heartbeat before it was caught and destroyed. With a shriek that only remotely resembled laughter, that slithers pointed an appendage at the isolated warrior. A beam of black light burst from its limb, and smashed through the Grey Knight's wards, which had turned from unbreakable fortress to merely almost impossible to break by his separation from his squad. The beam struck at the warrior's helmet, and his head simply vanished. Deeply ingrained muscle memory kept the headless corpse fighting for a few more seconds, cutting a dozen demons before it finally fell. By that point the 3 remaining Grey Knights had made it to the top of the altar, and 2 of them turned to hold the infernal tide while the third dueled the Dark Prince's abominable priest. A dozen scale tentacles rose, each holding a vicious-looking dagger, and at that slithers leapt at the silver-clad warrior with surprising speed. In the moment before contact, the Grey Knight took in the full aspect of his foe, something like a grotesque amalgamation of snakes, with an enormous one serving as the main body and the tails of smaller specimens serving as its myriad limbs. Its skin was pale, translucent in places, revealing organs that glowed with the youngest god's unholy blessings. With daggers forged in the corpse fires of its people and covered in poisons made from the same ingredients as the drugs its cultists had surrendered themselves to, that slithers struck at the Grey Knight. Half of its limbs fell before the blows could reach, severed in a single sweep of the Grey Knight's nemesis halberd. But the others hit, and though the warded plate glowed with seraphic power it was not enough to deflect them. For though Nereus Sanctus was no demon world yet, it hovered on the threshold of that apocalyptic transformation, and the gazes of the ruinous powers laid heavy upon it, empowering their minions in a way that made the slightest chance of harm a certainty. Blasphemously blessed blades bit deep into transhuman flesh, and the Grey Knight grunted as pain beyond anything he had ever experienced flooded his body. Yet he was a son of Titan, broken and remade on that hallowed moon, and well used to pain. His sword arm did not pause, and he struck deep into the creature's flesh, skewering it before pouring one last burst of psychic energy through its entire body. Only then did he collapse, willpower no longer able to keep him alive. As the corpse of that slithers fell from the altar, the demons it had summoned in its last moments began to lose substance, their tether to the materium sundered with the Slayer-Ineshi Lord's demise. Yet before dissolution could take hold, the ritual at the Dark Cathedral's heart pulsed once more, reinvigorating the Neverborn with its fell energies. At the same time, the corpse of that slithers twisted and burst as it hit the floor, cracking like a loathsome egg, and from it emerged an immense chaos spawn that snapped at the Grey Knights with blind, hungry mouths. The 2 Grey Knights fought long and well, but when the last survivor stood atop the heaving corpse of the chaos spawn, he was too exhausted to block the claw that cut through his spine and left him to bleed atop a pile of dead bodies, surrounded by Slayer-Ineshi demons that still feared to approach his prone form until he finally breathed his last. For what seemed like an eternity, the only sound within the Library of Truth had been the scratching of quills and the breath of 1,001 scribes. Though billions of words were written upon the gathered records, not one was spoken aloud, for each of the scribes had ritually cut out their own tongues before being admitted into the library. Every book of prayer, every scroll and piece of parchment that had survived the flames of Nereus Sanctus' conquest had been brought here, where the scribes of Zeonch could defile their contents. With a vast array of chemicals and tools, words of devotion and prayer were scrapped off, the text edited into a manner pleasing to the bestower of revelations, one of the uncounted masks of Zeonch, which was venerated in the Library of Truth. The scribes worked under the light of glowing mushrooms that grew out of the bodies of the library's previous custodians, who still lived despite the immense torment they suffered as the very light of knowledge was used to illuminate its defilement. Once they were done with one book or scroll, the scribes brought it to their lord, the Shrouded One, who looked upon it and judged its worth. Its inscrutable decision would determine where in the ever-expanding library the text would be stored, with the shelves closest to the Shrouded One's pulpit being the one thought the most prestigious. Of the 4 champions of chaos appointed by the Lord of Ash to oversee the wings of the Dark Cathedral, the Shrouded One was the only native to Nereus Sanctus. In another life, it had been a lowly menial of the ecclesiarchy, working in the archives, carrying piles of scrolls and ancient books from one place to the next, never given the time or education to look at the words it carried to its betters. When Keralit had begun weaving his web across the shrine world, it had been among the first to join the ranks of the cults the Dark Apostle had fostered. Until the Lord of Ash had whispered fragments of the primordial truth into its ears, it had never been discontent with its lot in life. It had never known anything else, after all. Born into a life of servitude and told from the cradle that such a life was a worthy one, it had never given any thought to ascending beyond its appointed station. All of that had changed as Keralit spoke to it and the others he had marked as potential recruits. The words of the Dark Apostle had planted the seed of ambition into its soul, and that seed had blossomed to transform the nameless menial into a towering shape of shadow, smoke and refracted light, covered within a shroud woven from the most sacred of scrolls. It was the foremost servant of Xionch on the entire world, and the architect of its former master's doom. Its greatest secret was that, even now, the Shrouded One did not know how to read. It was through other senses that he judged the merits of each work brought to it, dipping into the eldritch tides every time one of the scribes brought it their defiled manuscripts. The arrival of 4 grey knights sundered the silence that had fallen on the cathedral's eastern wing. Tottering piles of leather-bound books collapsed, and pages flying on the wind caught the sparks of teleportation and ignited. As the inferno spread, the tongueless scribes scrabbled to defend their domain from the gigantic invaders. Mutations that had been hidden beneath heavy robes and deep hoods were revealed to all as the gifts of the bestower of revelations were unleashed upon the Grey Knights. And still not a word was spoken. Even the Grey Knights were silent, communicating with one another through the telepathic bond they shared as they cut down the mutated scribes with blade and bolter. The flames licked their armor, turning blue and purple as they reached scrolls covered in unholy inks, but could not penetrate their blessed ceramite. For all their divine gifts, the scribes were not meant for battle. They could not hope to defeat the Grey Knights with martial might, and the scraps of sorcery they had been bestowed could not pierce the wards engraved within their armor. In an irony typical of the God of Lies, the most powerful incantations that had coalesced within their corrupted minds required a tongue to be spoken. Knowledge, in this case, was not power enough. Not on its own. The scribes died in silence, their blood and fluids adding to the desecration of the pieces of parchment that had survived the raging fire. On its pulpit, the Shrouded One watched the one-sided slaughter of its minions. Its fingers crackled with eldritch lightning, which it unleashed upon the 4 Grey Knights, heedless of the scribes caught in the blast. But though the sorcerous energy incinerated the scribes and burned the holy scrolls affixed to the Grey Knights' armor, it failed to penetrate the ceramite. The Grey Knights moved on with singular purpose, a blade of purification aimed at the champion of Xionch that had now revealed itself. Soon, the pulpit of the Shrouded One vanished in a hail of wooden shards as the Grey Knights opened fire with their mounted bolters, turning it to shreds. The Shrouded One leapt from its pedestal, landing amidst the flames of its library, and found itself surrounded by the 4 Grey Knights, its remaining scribes too far away to cross the inferno and come to its aid. Cornered and with no means of escape or triumph, the Shrouded One pleaded to its distant god, which had already granted it so much at the petty cost of its soul. It implored the bestower of revelations, begging the dark god to grant it the strength to slay these enemies of ruin that desecrated the library of truth with their violent actions. It thought of all the offerings the cultists had made, of the sacred lies they had written atop the ecclesiarchy's hollow truths, and asked for the reward it was due for these worthy deeds. In the court of change, the architect of fate heard this prayer, as it heard every prayer directed to it by the foolish and the deluded. One of its thousands of mouths smiled, and granted the Shrouded One the boon it had implored of the Chaos God. Knowledge bloomed into the mind of the Shrouded One, the sort of knowledge that sorcerers had destroyed entire civilizations to gain but a glimpse of. Understanding of one of the 999 names of Xionch burned bright within the champion's soul, granting it a direct channel to the all but infinite power of the God of Lies. As the 4 Grey Knights converged on it, the Shrouded One opened dry lips, and spoke the secret name of Xionch. Godlike power burst forth from it, shattering the wards of the Grey Knights' armor and turning their bodies to ash. Plates of charred ceramite fell to the ground, smoking as the remains of Titan's warriors were spread amidst the inferno that consumed the library of truth. The Shrouded One had just enough time to revel in its victory, in its new, incredible might, before the cost of wielding that power was enacted. Not only had the Shrouded One spoken the name of a god, it had done so while breaching the sacred rules of the library. Even as it burned, the precepts and curses that had been laid into the construction of this temple to the bestower of revelations retained their potency. There was just a moment, long enough for the Shrouded One to fully realize the depths of its predicament, then the wrath of the changing god fell upon it. The secret name it had been granted burned, consuming everything it was, had been and ever would be, obliterating its existence completely. With a final, wailing shriek, the Shrouded One disintegrated, not even condemned to the eternal flames of the warp where an echo of its knowledge might be harnessed by those who desired the architect of fate's doom. Empty robes fell to the ground, soon consumed by the flames that ravaged the entire library of truth, turning the entire wing of the dark cathedral to cinders. All as Zionch had willed it. Before Nereus Sanctus had fallen to chaos, tens of thousands had dwelled in the cathedral, the court of the cardinal, its attendants, and the countless menials who cleansed, kept records, and took care of 1,000 other duties. Furthermore, over the centuries, billions of pilgrims had come to Nereus Sanctus, traveling from all across the Azarok sector and beyond to bask in the glory of its temples and relics. Such a number of people needed to be fed, lest faith be overcome by hunger and the pilgrims riot in the cathedral's corridors. The blessed gardens produced some food, but all of it was reserved for the ecclesiarchy's highest-ranking members. The rest of the masses were not worthy of tasting the fruits of so hallowed a world. Foodstuffs were imported by the Megadon, ships carrying tithes of grain and meat from distant worlds. The vast kitchens that had kept the cathedral's inhabitants fed had been located underground, but as space twisted and entire sections of the structure collapsed and were rebuilt, they had ended up in the western wing. From the vats of soup distributed to the pilgrims to the fresh meat and fruits served to the cardinal, all had been made there, sustaining the lives of millions, and so when the time had come to build a temple to Nergal, Karalet's decision hadn't been difficult. A new kind of cooks and assistants now ruled the kitchens. Ingredients were brought from all across Nereus Sanctus, from the merely repugnant to the esoterically revolting. Not many corpses, as one might have thought, as the planet's infrastructure burned to the ground. Those had become one of the few plentiful sources of nourishment, and rarely made it to the kitchens. But the apostles of the plague god wandered the world, harvesting rotten organs and tears from the eyes of those about to be sacrificed. Black-robed and dragging their sacks behind them, they were a sight dreaded all over Nereus Sanctus, for they opposed them was to invite the displeasure of the god of life and death. And once their sacks were full, they returned to the dark cathedral, to the wing of plague, and emptied their dreadful harvests in the cellars before leaving once more. From these foul ingredients the cooks, each of whom bore the mark of Nergal on their flesh and soul, crafted mixtures that were part poison, part disease and part invigorating cure, tasting their brews for themselves before feeding it to the unfortunate souls that sat at the vast banqueting table at the center of the wing. 77 diners were kept at the table at all time, eating the fruit of the cook's labor on fine plates and with silverware stolen from the dead cardinal's own suites. They had been drawn first from the prisoners of Nereus Sanctus' conquest, and, once that stock had run out, captured at random from the cultists of chaos outside the dark cathedral by the collectors. Some had even volunteered for the position, offering themselves up to the collectors, their deluded minds believing that this would gain them Nergal's favor. Regardless of how they had come to the table, most of the diners died before finishing a single course, their bodies racked by terrible fevers or dissolving from the inside. Their bodies were then taken off the table and tossed into the pit of liquefied organic matter that served both as a disposing hole and as a source of condiments for the cooks. The truly unfortunate diners were either resilient enough to endure, or were twisted by the esoteric concoctions of the disciples of Nergal until they were either released to join the cooks or transformed into something that could no longer be kept at the table. Such grotesque mutants were then gently guided outside, to spread the gifts of the grandfather to the rest of Nereus Sanctus. A few were kept to assist in the cooking, either to carry particularly heavy ingredients and utensils, or to pacify unruly diners. Melicia presided over the proceedings, grim-faced as she plunged another ingredient into her great cauldron. She was called the Brooding Sorrow by her minions, though never where she might hear them. The Lord of Ash had found her on a human world where technology had been destroyed by the Wailing Storm, its human population reduced to a medieval existence, with tribes living in the shadows, fearful of the monsters that stalked the land. Melicia had been one such monster, a dread witch of the woods, last of her tribe after she killed them all for the crime of mocking her ugliness. Her devotion to Nurgle was a simple, direct thing. The grandfather alone had never mocked her, the grandfather alone had welcomed her and told her she was beautiful to him. Despite her many deformities, out of all the cooks Malicia looked the most human of all, for Nurgle's pestilent blessings had taken root in her mind and soul rather than her flesh. She could have walked into the less reputable districts of a hive city and barely drawn a glance, if not for the aura of soul-blasting dread that cloaked her like the patchwork clothes she wore over her wizened frame. When 5 Grey Knights manifested in her kitchens in a flash of lightning and ozone, Malicia did not rage or laugh. She frowned, and with an annoyed gesture, a snap of her fingers and a barked order, commanded her minions to deal with the intrusion, before returning her attention to her bubbling cauldron. Black-robed collectors charged the knights, swirling their half-empty sacks as improvised weapons. They smacked against silver warplate with meaty sounds, and while they did not break it they leaked gruesome fluids over the engraved blessings, causing the armor to sizzle as it burned away the corruption. The sheer strength of the blows, however, for the collectors had been granted all the strength needed to carry their repugnant burdens across continents without pause by Nurgle, was enough to make even the Grey Knights buckle. One particular bag, which had contained the bound souls of children, the desecrated bones of martyrs and the bile of the Chaos Spawn, reacted more violently to the Grey Knight's holy armor. The Neverborn that had been gestating inside was suddenly awakened from its fetal torpor, and lashed out with panicked claws made of tibias and spines. Surprised, its collector let go of it, and the newly spawned nightmare rampaged, striking and wailing with such vigor that, before the Grey Knights could put it down, one of them laid on the filth-covered floor, his armor and chest caved in by a blow from an amalgamation of holy skulls, the traces of faith lingering on the bones enough to go through the warded warplate. The 4 remaining Grey Knights fought against the collectors, struggling to put them down. Unnatural resilience was but one of the many gifts Nurgle had bestowed upon them, but eventually the last of them fell, just in time for the lumbering abominations that served as the cook's assistants to join the fray. Hulking masses of rotting muscle smashed and belched, releasing putrescent breaths. Blessed scrolls blackened and fell to ash. And still Malicia kept stirring her pot, unconcerned. She heard the sound of battle, of blessed blades bursting through bile-filled bellies, of bolt of fire and of her congregation screaming in wrath and praise to the god of life and death. Yet still she kept stirring, not lifting her gaze from her work, until one of the Grey Knights forced his way through the throng of diseased cultists and monsters, and brought down his nemesis' sword to cut off her head. Malicia reached out with her stick-thin arm, and pushed. The Grey Knight was sent flying by her monstrous strength, went over the table and fell into the pool of decaying, bubbling organic matter. For a few seconds, the warrior managed to stay afloat, then the things that lived in the cesspool dragged him under, never to emerge again. Seconds later, Malicia's cataracted eyes widened as she felt the shift in the pit's energies and realized her mistake. The pool of decayed corpses had been, until now, an offering to Nurgle, a great mix of poisons and diseases, the combination of thousands of leftovers. But the addition of the Grey Knight's untainted flesh, of his soul laden in holy scripture and words of seraphic power, reacted violently with the warp energies that had been slowly accumulating in the pit. The entire western wing of the Dark Cathedral was lost in the ensuing explosion, and the whole Dark Cathedral shook to its foundations. The Chaos ships in orbit saw the blast on their instruments, while witches and cult leaders across Nereus Sanctus froze and wailed as the earth trembled once more beneath their feet. Karalit felt the approach of the Grey Knight long before the sound of the warrior's footsteps reached his ears. Here, at the nexus of the 4 wings of the Dark Cathedral, the presence of the Imperium's champion was a peal of discordant thunder in the careful symphony of ruin the Lord of Ash had composed. Yet even that disharmony would be pleasant to the Dark Gods, if he could turn it into the prelude to the symphony's climax. The Dark Apostle's face was bare, revealing the grotesque patchwork of scars, burns, and impossibly smooth skin that covered his skull. He had lost his horned helmet long ago, in the same fires that had consumed his face. Save for his headgear, he wore his full panoply of war, painted in black and gold, covered in sigils that called to the Pantheon and holding his crozius in both hands, the weapon's head laying against the stone floor where he knelt in prayer. Since Chaos had claimed the planet, only 2 souls had been permitted within this most blessed of grounds. Not even the 4 archpriests Karalit had chosen from among the masses of the lost and the damned were allowed within what had been the most sacrosanct location of the entire shrine world. The high, arched chamber was where Saint Nereus had been buried centuries ago. When Karalit had first entered it, after he had slaughtered the cardinal and his guards and used the man's decapitated head to force open the biometric locks, the walls had been covered in mosaics depicting the deeds for which Nereus Gallienevos had been recognized as an imperial saint by the ecclesiarchy upon his death. Those mosaics were gone now. Karalit had removed each of the ceramic pieces by his own hands, dipping them into unguents made of the tears of captive never born before affixing them anew to form patterns pleasing to the pantheon. Abstract representations of the 4 now looked down upon the altar to ruin the dark apostle had made of the false saint's tomb. Breaking the grave open had been the very act that had enabled the never-born to roam the cathedral years ago. There was power in faith, even when it was hideously misguided, and by defiling the remnants of Saint Nereus Karalit had been able to subvert that power to his own ends. The mosaics shifted now, rearranging themselves according to the whims of the gods. In the last hour, they had shown Karalit what had happened across the rest of his dark cathedral. His priests were dead, their souls dispatched to the ruinous powers, or, in the case of the Shrouded One, annihilated by the divine power it had touched. But the slaves of the corpse emperor had bled for their victories, and their succession of costly triumphs would end here. The silver-clad warrior came from the north, if directions could be said to have any meaning left in this nexus of eldritch energies. He emerged from the scenes of blood-soaked carnage, his armor rent and cracked. Karalit shivered at the scent of his potent vitae, charged with psychic power that reflected that of the emperor himself. He remembered the taste of that power, from the time he had been forced to kneel amidst the ashes of monarchia, and the master of mankind had judged the entire 17th Legion through his servant, the Sigillite. It was much weaker now than it had been then, but the nature of it remained unmistakable to any who had felt the might of he on earth. "I am Karalit," the Dark Apostle called out as he pushed himself to his feet, raising his crozius and laying it to rest on his shoulder. "Chosen of Arkin, the Lord of Ash, and conqueror of this benighted world by the grace of the true gods. What is your name, Grey Knight?" There was no pause, no moment of shock rippling through the warrior's aura as revelation dawned upon him. The Grey Knight was far too disciplined for that. But Karalit perceived the sudden shift of his distant cousin's mind as he processed the words of the Lord of Ash and their implications. Karalit chuckled. "Yes, Grey Knight," he repeated, making a mockery of the title. "I know what you are." In truth, he knew little more than the name. The secretive chapter had done terrible things to keep their history under wraps, and by and large, they had succeeded. The Awakened One himself had heard about them from Abaddon when the 2 of you had spoken through sorcery before the Black Crusade. Where and how the new War Master of Chaos had learned about the Knights of Titan's existence was unknown to Karalit. It did not matter, though. "Come now," he continued as the knight remained silent. "Do you have no manners? We stand beneath the gaze of the gods, Grey Knight. Well, mine, at least. Yours is as blind to what happens here as he is deaf to the screams of those who perished on this world." "Heretic," the knight spoke at last. Despite his wounds, his voice was clear, full of wrath and contempt. "The Emperor sees all. I am his blade, and he is my strength." "And does his blade have a name?" Karalit asked mockingly, though not taking his eyes off the warrior in silver. "Or has even that most basic of rights been taken from the new defenders of the Imperium?" "When I send you to the foul abominations you call gods," spat the paladin, "tell them that it is Demetrius who purged the galaxy of your taint." So confident. So righteous. Was this what the sons of Lorga had sounded like to the other legions, before the Emperor had broken their pride along with their faith? Blood of the gods, they must have been insufferable. The Grey Knight was looking at the chamber, specifically, his gaze kept returning to the gateways that led to the other wings of the dark cathedral. Karalit smiled. "Your brothers are dead, Sir Knight, and will not be joining us here. You alone survived the trials of this dark cathedral. And so it must come down to single combat, a duel between the champions of our respective masters, to determine the fate of this world. Poetic, do you not think? The vile ritual you have perpetrated upon this world will be stopped," vowed the Grey Knight. "The might of the Emperor shall crush your corrupt workings." Karalit gestured to the altar to chaos he had made of Saint Nereus' tomb. The bones of the dead saint had been dug out of his stone coffin, and made into a suit of armor that covered the still living form of the broken thing that had once been Gailey's servitors. Almost nothing remained of the former Inquisitor, save just enough sentience and memory to suffer the full extent of his torment. His legs and arms were gone, and both his cybernetic and natural eye had been plucked out. Every inch of his skin that had not been flayed was covered in tiny Colchizian scripture, the black ink burning with warp fire. The inspiration had come from the ritual Archon had used on Paraxis, where he had bound the essence of the demon prince Serexithar as an anchor to sustain the wailing storm. Karalet's ambitions were much lesser in scale, however, and so a mere mortal had sufficed as a crucible. Even so, that mortal had needed to be exceptional, the potent soul of an Inquisitor, carefully broken over several weeks of the Lord of Ash's tender care, followed by the great treachery that had crippled the Azeroth conclave. By the time Gales had been returned to Karalet, brought to Nereus Sanctus aboard a small ship detached from the Black Crusade, he had been a worthy servant of the Dark Gods, and thus, a suitable sacrifice for Karalet's vision. Sigils of wardings were carved into his bones. Without them, the incredible energies coursing through his soul would have transformed his flesh into an erupting mess as his genetic code succumbed to spawnhood. Even then, Gales' torso bore the stigmatas of mutation. Patches of scales gleamed in the light of the shifting walls, and clusters of eyes blossomed between the exposed muscles, shining with infernal radiance. "The ritual is almost complete," proudly declared Karalet. "The deaths of the 4 champions served as the second-to-last offering to sunder the veil across this world forever. If I kill you and offer up your death to the Pantheon, Nereus Sanctus will be remade into a demon world. If you kill me, well, the gods do not look kindly upon failure. My doom shall be terrible indeed, but this world's shall be no less so." "So," he continued, raising his Crozius and pointing it at the Grey Knight. "Shall we begin?" Without another word, Demetrius charged the Dark Apostle, and the warrior in silver dueled with the one clad in black and gold. The darkly hallowed Crozius met the Nemesis blade, the weapons clashing in a shower of sparks as their wielders matched their strength and skill. Demetrius was strong, even with his wounds, his physical prowess further enhanced by his psychic powers. But Karalet met every blow, blocking or dodging, a corona of dark power shrouding his armored body, filling the air with the scent of burned blood whenever it met the Grey Knight's own seraphic aura. The infernal sigils emblazoned upon his Crozius glowed with fell radiance as the weapon clashed with the Nemesis blade, and every blow resonated with the god's heartbeat. "Are you surprised?" called out Karalet as the two duelists disengaged, putting distance between them as they circled one another. "Did you expect that you would slay me easily? You face not the discarded children of the Black Crusade, harvested by the Forsaken Sons and thrown to blunt the blade of imperial retribution," Karalet went on. "I am a chosen of Archon, a dark apostle of the primordial truth. I fought at Calthan Terra during the rebellion, and entire worlds have been brought to heel by my will alone. Here, Sir Knight, you and your brothers fought the chosen servants of the Dark Gods. Under the scars, Karalet was smiling. And they were forewarned of your strength, all of them. We watched as Beranos fell, and listened to the words of those who escaped the wrath of the Imperium there. We have your measure now, Sir Knight." The Dark Apostle was laughing now, and the walls rippled as the gods shared in his amusement. "And as you and your brothers fight and bleed across Azeroth, desperately trying to stop us, Lord Archon continues his hunt for the greatest prize of all." Like the other chosen, with the exception of the Blood Champion, who was too far lost to bloodlust, Karalet had been told of Archon's true goal in Azeroth. The Black Crusade was merely a prelude, a cover for his true purpose. When the Nightmare Fleet was unleashed, the devastation already wrought upon the Imperium would pale in comparison to what would follow, and the demon world of Nereus Sanctus would stand as a monument to the Forsaken Son's triumph. "Part of me longs to speak to you," Karalet breathed even as he ducked under a blow that would have cut his head clean off. "To extol the virtues of the primordial truth, to help you shed the blinders that have been put upon your soul to keep it from realizing its full potential." He blocked another strike aimed at his left flank, before stepping back and forcing his mouth into a configuration no human lips had ever been intended to take. The infernal word that he forced through his vocal cords rang through the air, briefly battering at the Grey Knight's armor with the strength of a thunderstrike. A couple of teeth shattered in Karalet's mouth, and he grinned, blood flowing on his chin from ruined gums. "But I was warned against that temptation," he laughed,
tasting iron and ozone on his tongue. It is not written that the first Grey Knight to turn against the false emperor will be illuminated by my hand. To try would be to repeat the mistake Corphaeron made at Calth, when he could have cut Guilliman's thread but chose instead to try and bring him to our side. His words turned into a shout as he went back on the offensive. Again and again their weapons clashed. Karalit scored first blood, his Crozius grazing the Grey Knight's right knee. The tip of Demetrius' sword cut at the Dark Apostle's left shoulder, sending a small growth of ceramite shaped like the extended claw of a neverborn to the ground, where it began to twitch and crawl until the Grey Knight crushed it underfoot. Words of power burned in Karalit's mind as he fought. He held nothing back, calling upon all the dark lore he had accumulated over the long years of conquest in the Wailing Storm. He assembled the fragmented names of demons in his brain, calling upon the debts of blood and sacrifice that he was owed from the denizens of the warp. He was stronger, faster, mightier than ever before, mightier than the silver-clad knight of the Imperium that stood before him, wounded and bleeding from the wounds inflicted upon him by the Slaughter Prince's trials. Most of Karalit's contributions to the cause of the Forsaken Sons had been esoteric in nature. He had brought the primitive civilizations of the Wailing Storm to worship of the primordial truth, had helped subvert regimes and bind mighty demons to the Warband's purpose. But he remained a warrior at heart, taken from long-dead Colchis and crafted into a weapon of war first and foremost. He exulted in his renewed purpose, in the purity of this moment. He and the other Space Marines of the 9 legions had been discarded by the false emperor, thrown aside and replaced by the likes of Demetrius, yet with the blessings of the dark gods, Karalit was winning, and proving that the Carrion god had chosen poorly. The Lord of Ashes Crozius smashed past the Grey Knights and into his torso. The Dark Apostle heard the crack of ceramite and bone, and Demetrius stumbled back, falling to one knee. Karalit rushed forward, raising his Crozius in a two-handed grip, aiming to smash the Grey Knight's skull before cutting him open and offer his entrails to the powers. As he moved, the downed Imperial hero raised his storm bolter, aiming it square at Karalit. With his warp-enhanced reflexes, the Dark Apostle saw the shot coming long before Demetrius pulled the trigger. He dodged, hearing the projectile fly past his head, and the bolt slammed into the skull of Gailey's servitors, detonating once it had penetrated deep past the bone and into the soft brain matter underneath. The Inquisitor's headless corpse twitched, once, as his soul was released from his prolonged torment and destroyed in a single flash of warp fire. Karalit began to shout, turning toward the center of the chamber in horror. But he never completed the word. For with the destruction of the catalyst for his great ritual, the wrath of the dark gods had descended upon Nereus Sanctus, just as the Lord of Ash had predicted, and it was terrible indeed. The vast eldritch energies that had been accumulated through months of sacrifices and monstrous acts, meant to permanently sunder the veil between materium and immaterium, were suddenly released. There was not enough time for Karalit to even finish his own thought before his body was obliterated, along with that of Demetrius and the entire Nexus chamber. Outside the chamber, the dark cathedral erupted in warp fire that spread from it in a hellish ring that went farther and farther, engulfing all of Nereus Sanctus and leaving naught but ash in its wake. Bodies of water were turned to vapor, and even the stone of mountains was incinerated. Clouds of ash rose in the sky in the Inferno's wake, ascending kilometers before falling down in a crushing shroud that brought down the last structures that had survived the flames. The flotilla assembled in orbit, whose ships had stayed perilously close to the world in order to share in its blessings when the ritual was completed, was rent asunder as columns of eldritch fire reached out hundreds of kilometers, drawn by the shining souls within the cult vessels. Burned wrecks came toppling down through the blazing atmosphere, their cataclysmic impacts raising even more clouds of ash across Nereus Sanctus' charred corpse. Only the sliver of atonement, protected from the sorcerous onslaught by the wards carved into its structure, survived the hellish flames. Even with those holy wards protecting it, it was still damaged, and it took days to its crew to restore functions beyond the most critical of life support. When this was done, the mortal shipmaster ordered its auspex turned to Nereus Sanctus, to find what had transpired and whether any of the crew's Astartes masters yet lived. Soon, it was clear that such was not the case. Not a single life form remained on Nereus Sanctus that the ship's sensors could detect, yet there was movement in the ash covering the entire world. Probes dispatched onto the surface sent grainy picts of humanoid shapes formed of the uniform black ash wandering aimlessly. There were thousands of these ghastly revenants, with their number increasing as the probes drew nearer to the former location of the Dark Cathedral. No probe managed to reach the cathedral's site, all of them glitched and crashed when they got less than a kilometer from it. At that distance, the pic feeds showed many more ashen silhouettes, including one that was much taller than the other, and seemed to hold in its hand a long, mace-shaped object. After failing to find any trace of the Grey Knights, the Sliver of Atonement left Nereus Sanctus, carrying word of its demise to the rest of the Imperium. It left the system dead in its wake, populated only by the ghosts of ash that haunted the devastated Shrine world.